Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, The Last Call from Room 3. The night had settled over the neighborhood like a thick, suffocating blanket. I arrived at the house just after 7, the last rays of sunlight dipping behind the row of maple trees that lined the street. The porch light flickered weakly as I stepped up onto the stoop, my breath visible in the cool autumn air. I had babysat before, but never for the Parkers. They were relatives of a friend, people I barely knew, and I figured a simple evening of watching two kids wasn't going to be anything out of the ordinary. I was wrong. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door swung open. Mrs. Parker smiled warmly, her eyes a little tired, but kind. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she said. Her voice was soft but held an edge of urgency I didn't understand at the time. "We have to be at the hospital tonight. Our daughter's having an emergency procedure. I hope it won't be too much trouble." I nodded, trying to sound reassuring even though a knot had tightened in my stomach. "Of course. I'm happy to help." Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't place, maybe bleach or some medicinal cleaner. It was neat but sparse, the kind of home that felt lived in but not personalized. 2 pairs of shoes lined up neatly by the door, a pair of small, scuffed sneakers resting beside a pair of worn leather loafers. The children appeared from the hallway, a boy around 8 and a girl maybe 6, crawling out of a room decorated with pastel wallpaper and shelves lined with stuffed animals. They seemed quiet and cautious, holding onto each other as they looked me up and down. "Hi, I'm Emily," I said, crouching to meet their eyes. "I'm going to stay with you until your parents come back." The boy, whose name I learned was Lucas, nodded shyly but didn't say much. The girl, Mia, gave a tentative smile and clutched her ragged teddy bear to her chest. I offered to read them a story, but they seemed uninterested, their attention drifting to the window, where the streetlights began to flicker on one by one. Mrs. Parker quickly went over the rules. "No going outside, don't open the door for anyone, and if there's any trouble, call me on the landline first, then 911. She pulled me aside briefly and handed me a list of emergency numbers, along with instructions on the kids' medications and bedtime routine. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. As soon as the front door closed, the house seemed to grow colder. I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. The kids retreated to the living room, where they sat close together on the couch, eyes glued to the muted television. I made some popcorn and poured juice, attempting to keep the atmosphere calm and normal. Time passed slowly. I glanced repeatedly at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. The hospital had said the procedure would be quick, but the hours stretched out, and the darkness outside thickened. I tried to distract the children with a board game, but Lucas's focus faltered, and Mia grew restless. "Can I use the bathroom?" Mia asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. The bathroom was down the hall, near the basement door. "Sure, but don't wander off anywhere else," I said, standing and following her at a distance. She disappeared behind the bathroom door, and as I waited outside, a faint noise caught my attention, a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor in the basement below. My heart quickened. The basement door was closed tight, but I could swear I heard a low thud, and then silence. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. The house was old, noises crept in from pipes and settling walls all the time. Mia returned, looking pale. "Sorry, I didn't feel good," she whispered. I asked if she wanted to lie down on the couch, and she nodded, curling into a ball with her teddy bear. Lucas sat quietly beside her, his eyes wide and unblinking. The night deepened. The television flickered with static as the power seemed to waver. I checked my phone, no signal. The landline was the only connection to the outside world. Then the phone rang. I jumped, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. The caller ID showed no name, just a string of numbers I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I said, voice shaky. Silence. Then a breath, ragged and slow, followed by a whispering voice that sent chills through me. "Emily." I swallowed hard. Who is this? No answer. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver, heart pounding. Was this a prank? A wrong number? Or something worse? The children were watching me, their faces blank. I tried to smile but couldn't hide the fear creeping in. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I decided to call the hospital to check on Mrs. Parker. My fingers fumbled dialing the number on the slip of paper, but the line was dead. Panic welled inside me. The house suddenly felt like a trap. I moved toward the front door to check the locks, and that's when I noticed it, faint footprints in the dust on the floor near the basement. They were small, like a child's, but I had been the only one walking through the hallway. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I wasn't alone. I called out softly, "Is someone there?" No reply. I edged toward the basement door, hand hovering over the knob. The scraping noise returned, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that raised every hair on my arms. I wanted to run, to grab the kids and get out, but something held me back. A part of me needed to understand what was happening. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the knob and opened the door to the basement. The darkness inside was suffocating. My eyes adjusted slowly. A faint glow from a broken basement window revealed scattered boxes, an old workbench, and something else. A small, torn piece of fabric caught on a nail, flapping slightly in the cold draft. Then I heard it, a soft, childlike giggle echoing from the shadows below. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my breath ragged. The children were still on the couch, eyes wide and unblinking. I gathered them close, wrapping my arms around both, whispering promises of safety that felt hollow even to me. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The house creaked and moaned around us, alive with secrets I was only beginning to uncover. The clock read 8:14 p.m. when I finally settled into the worn armchair by the window, the dim streetlight outside casting a thin, pale glow across the living room. The house was quiet now, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the faint hum of the heater. I'd been here an hour, since the parents had left, and at first, everything had seemed normal, too normal, maybe. The kind of normal that makes you feel like you're waiting for something to go wrong. Emily was upstairs, tucked into bed after I read her the story she picked out from the shelf. The little girl was shy but polite, her wide eyes glancing at me with a kind of tentative trust that felt fragile. I'd never babysat anyone so young before, and I was nervous, but not about Emily. It was the house itself that unnerved me. Somewhere deep down I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the house settling, or the shadows playing tricks on my mind. I tried to focus on the TV but couldn't keep my attention on the muted sitcom reruns. The sound of a door creaking upstairs made me jump. I told myself it was normal, Emily shifting in bed, or maybe one of the old floorboards groaning. Yet something about the sound felt deliberate. I put down the remote and stood up, glancing toward the staircase. The dark hallway beyond looked narrow and endless. I called out softly, "Emily? You okay up there?" No answer. I was about to head upstairs when the phone rang. The shrill, sudden noise made me jump again. I grabbed it from the side table. "Hello?" I said, voice tight. There was silence on the other end, just static and that faint, nearly imperceptible sound of breathing. I swallowed hard. Is this a joke? Then a whisper, so faint I wasn't sure if I heard it right. Look downstairs. The line went dead. My heart pounded. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch my breath. It had to be a prank call. But who would call this number? My cell phone was in my bag, turned off. This was the house phone, nobody else was here. The parents' phone was upstairs, and I checked the house before settling in. No one else should be here. Still, I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. The first rule of babysitting was to stay calm. I started walking toward the bottom of the stairs, but I stopped halfway. Something moved in the shadows at the far end of the hallway. A glimpse of a dark shape, a flicker of movement that disappeared when I blinked. I told myself it was my imagination, but I didn't take my eyes off that spot. The minutes dragged on like hours as I stared down the hallway. Then, a faint noise, soft thudding, like footsteps. Not the slow, heavy kind, but quick and light, almost like someone tiptoeing. I dropped the phone onto the table, the receiver hitting the wood with a dull thump. I told myself I needed to check on Emily again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I crept up the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The hallway above was darker than downstairs, the walls closing in like a tunnel. I reached Emily's door and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty. My heart seized. The bed was neatly made, the covers smoothed out as if she'd never been there. I called out her name, voice rising. No response. I hurried down the hall, checking each door. The bathroom was empty. The linen closet, the guest room, nothing. Panic started to claw its way up my throat. I raced back downstairs, searching the rooms, the closets, the kitchen. The front and back doors were locked tight. No sign of Emily anywhere. I tried calling my parents on my cell for help, but there was no signal. The house seemed to be in some dead spot, isolated from the outside world. Then I noticed the phone was off the hook. Someone had been here. I looked back toward the stairs, noticing something I missed before, a narrow trail of muddy footprints leading up the carpeted steps. They were small, too small to be mine. A cold realization washed over me. Emily wasn't upstairs. She wasn't anywhere in the house as far as I could tell. I grabbed the phone and tried it again. When it rang, I heard the same static and that faint breathing, now mixed with a soft giggle. I held the receiver to my ear. Who is this? Where is Emily? The giggle turned into a whisper. Look outside. My hands trembled as I moved toward the window. Pulling aside the curtain, I stared into the backyard. Under the dim light of the porch, there was a figure, a child, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out the face, but the way it stood left no doubt. It wasn't Emily. I called out, voice cracking. Hey! Are you okay? The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the shadows beyond the fence. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away. My mind raced. Who was that? Where was Emily? There was a sudden noise from the basement door, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. The door was cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of darkness. The basement. I hadn't gone down there yet. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should call the police or get out, but something rooted me in place. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and crept over to the basement door. The air at the bottom of the stairs was cold and thick, smelling faintly of damp earth and something chemical, like bleach or something stronger. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. As I shone the flashlight into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement. A pair of small feet shaking slightly just beyond the first step. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat and started down. "Emily?" I whispered. The footsteps stopped. There was a soft, wet sound, like someone breathing heavily. Then a voice, barely audible, "Help me." I found her huddled in the corner, clutching her knees, eyes wide and shining with tears. She looked pale, and there were scratches on her arms. I reached out to her. "It's okay, I'm here." She looked up, and for a moment, I thought relief washed over her face. Then her eyes darted toward the basement stairs, and she whispered, "He's still here." The basement door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but the door was locked tight. We were trapped. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the darkness pressed closer. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the light, I knew we weren't alone. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting on the worn couch in the living room, the flickering light of the television casting uneven shadows across the walls. The house felt heavier now, as if the darkness was pressing in on me, thick and suffocating. I kept glancing toward the stairwell, where the faintest creak had sounded earlier, but nothing moved. At least, nothing I could see. The kids had been tucked in for nearly an hour. Emily was asleep in her crib at the end of the hall, breathing shallow and steady, and Lucas was in his room, a soft glow spilling from the night light shaped like a moon. I told myself I was just exhausted, that the unease in my chest was nothing more than first-time babysitting jitters. But the silence in the house was wrong, unnatural. I tried to shake the feeling and focused on the television, but the noise felt distant, as if I were underwater. My eyes kept drifting back to the hallway, the place where shadows gathered and stretched like claws. Every time I thought about going to check on the kids, my legs turned to stone. I was frozen, caught somewhere between fear and responsibility. Then the phone rang. The sharp, unexpected sound sliced through the silence, and I jumped. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might burst through my ribs. I scrambled for the receiver on the coffee table, nearly knocking it over. "Hello?" I whispered, voice barely audible. Silence answered me. I waited, holding the receiver to my ear, willing someone to speak. After a long breath, a faint voice whispered, "Look upstairs." I froze. The call disconnected before I could say anything. My breath hitched as I stared at the phone. "Look upstairs." My mind spun, trying to rationalize it. Could it be Lucas's prank? He was 12, and he loved to scare me, but he was supposed to be asleep. And Emily was just a baby. Who else could it have been? I stood, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, and decided to check the kids. Step by step, I moved down the hall, every sound amplified in the quiet. The baby's room came first. When I peered inside, Emily was still asleep, wrapped in a soft blanket. Nothing had changed. I moved onto Lucas's room, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open carefully. The room was dark except for the pale glow of the moonlight nightlight. Lucas was on his bed, eyes closed, covered by his blanket, his chest rising and falling steadily. Relief flooded me. Maybe it had been a prank call or something accidental. I turned to leave, but the noise stopped me, a low shuffling coming from the attic hatch above the hallway. I hadn't noticed the hatch before, but there it was, a small square door set into the ceiling. The sound was faint but unmistakable, something moving up there. I pulled my phone from my pocket, using the flashlight to illuminate the hatch. My hands trembled as I reached for the rusty latch. It felt sticky, like it hadn't been opened in years. With a sharp creak, the hatch swung upward, revealing a narrow staircase leading upwards into blackness. My heart pounded, but a strange curiosity pulled me forward. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak echoing like a gunshot. At the top, the attic was cold and musty, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets and boxes stacked in haphazard piles. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching spider webs and peeling wallpaper. I scanned the space but saw nothing moving. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the furnace below. I took a deep breath and started to turn away when I noticed something on the floor, a footprint pressed into a layer of dust. It was small, child-sized, but the details were strange. The toes splayed unnaturally wide, as if something was trying to mimic a human foot but failing. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to get out of there, to run back to the safety of the living room, but then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost a breath, right behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. Just the empty attic, cold and silent. I hurried down the stairs and closed the hatch behind me, locking it tight. Back in the hallway, the oppressive feeling deepened. I leaned against the wall, fighting the urge to collapse. Then, from the kitchen, I heard a thud. A heavy, dull sound like something falling. I moved toward the kitchen slowly, trying to steady my breathing. When I reached the doorway, I saw the back door wide open, swinging in the night breeze that pushed the curtains against the walls. The latch was broken, hanging loosely. Someone had been in the house. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and checked every other door and window. All were secure except that one. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I wanted to call the police, but my phone had no signal. The house was on the edge of town, surrounded by woods, and my only link to the outside world was dead. I went back to the kids' rooms. Both were still asleep, seemingly untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. I sat back down on the couch, my eyes fixed on the hallway. The owls groaned around me, and I felt the darkness pressing closer. For the first time, I truly understood how alone I was. And how vulnerable. The night stretched on, each minute heavier than the last. I kept hearing noises, footsteps in the attic, the creak of the stairs, whispers just beyond hearing. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself it was a house settling, my imagination running wild. But deep inside, I knew. I was not alone. The babysitter's nightmare had just begun. The minute I stepped through the front door, the house felt colder, like the air itself had been drained of warmth during the hours I'd been away. It was early evening, the sun settling just beyond the street's crooked line of maples, and even though the sky still had color, shadows pulled in the corners of the living room, hugging the baseboards like they were waiting for something. I could hear the faint soundtrack of the TV upstairs, which was odd because I had told Mia to turn it off before I left to grab the groceries. I dropped the bags on the kitchen counter and called out, "Mia? You okay?" No answer. Usually, she'd yell back something like, "Yeah, I'm fine," or "I'm watching my show," but the house was silent except for the soft hum coming from the TV. I remembered the note Mia had left on the fridge earlier that day, "Don't turn on the basement lights." I had scoffed at it, figuring it was just a weird joke or something she picked up from one of her friends. But now, standing in the kitchen, the words came back to me with strange weight. That basement light hadn't been on when I left. Had it been on at all today? I wiped my hands on my jeans and started upstairs. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the walls closer, as if they were pressing in on me the longer I walked. The TV's glow flickered in the dark room at the end of the hall. I peeked inside. Mia was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, staring at the screen. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked tired, but she smiled when she saw me. "Hey," I said softly, sitting beside her. "Why didn't you turn the TV off like I asked?" She shrugged. "I just wanted to finish this episode." The power flickered earlier, and it scared me a bit. I nodded, trying to shrug off the unease tightening my chest. All right, well, dinner's ready in a few minutes. Did you play any games or anything? No, she said quickly, eyes darting toward the basement door at the end of the hall. That door was always closed, but now I noticed a faint light spilling under its crack. My heart skipped. I forced myself to sound casual. Did you turn on the basement light? Her small face twisted into a frown. No. I told you I wouldn't. Why? I stood up. Nothing. Just checking. But my mind was spinning. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept to the basement door. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made your own breathing sound loud and ragged. The light under the door was definitely on. I pressed my ear against the wood. There was a low humming sound, like a muted buzzing, but no footsteps or voices. The basement stairs groaned under my weight as I slowly descended, flashlight trembling in my hand. At the bottom, the bulb hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly, though there was no draft. The room looked empty, save for the usual clutter of old furniture and storage boxes. The basement light was indeed on, casting long shadows that danced over damp walls. I swept the flashlight across the room, trying to spot whatever had caused the hum. My beam landed on the old, rusted water heater in the far corner. It was vibrating softly, making the strange noise. I sighed in relief. Faulty wiring again. I turned to head back up when something caught my eye, a small, crumpled piece of paper on the floor near the stairs. I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like someone had written it in a hurry. I'm watching you. A chill crawled up my spine. This was no joke. I hurried upstairs, clutching the note, and found Mia still seated on the floor, eyes glued to the television. I slid the note across the coffee table to her. She read it, then looked up at me, eyes wide with fear. I didn't write that, she whispered. Neither did I. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to piece together what was happening. The house that was supposed to be safe suddenly felt like a trap. Did you hear anything strange while I was gone? I asked her again. She hesitated, then nodded. I thought I heard someone whispering, but when I looked, no one was there. My throat tightened. I told her to stay upstairs and locked the basement door from the outside, wedging a chair against it. Then I went to the front door and locked it twice, checking every window. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of forced entry or anything missing. But that note, the basement light, the whispers, they told a different story. I sat down beside Mia, pulling her close. The house groaned under the weight of an unseen presence, and I realized that whatever had started this wasn't going to leave us alone anytime soon. The night stretched ahead, thick with shadows and unanswered questions. I kept the flashlight close, my fingers gripping it like a lifeline, wondering how I was going to protect a child from something I couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence like cold breath against my neck. Mia's small hand trembled in mine, and I squeezed it, a fragile anchor in this storm. Every creak and shuffle felt deliberate, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. I knew then that hiding wouldn't keep us safe. We had to confront whatever lurked in the shadows before it decided to claim us both. I never thought a simple night of babysitting could unravel like that, but as I sat in the living room, the dim glow of the lamp barely cutting through the shadows, I understood how quickly things could spiral out of control. The house felt different now, like the walls themselves were closing in, watching me with silent, patient eyes. Earlier that evening, I had arrived just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The Johnsons were typical neighbors in the quiet cul-de-sac, a young couple who trusted me implicitly. Their 2-year-old daughter, Lily, was supposed to be asleep in her crib upstairs by then. I'd been there a few times before, but tonight something felt off the moment I stepped inside. After settling Lily down with her favorite lullaby and storybook, I slipped downstairs, thinking I finally had the time to catch up on my reading. But the house, usually warm and inviting, seemed sterile and cold. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, interrupted only by the occasional creak from upstairs. I remember the first odd thing clearly. I was in the kitchen, washing my hands, when I noticed the fridge door was slightly ajar. I closed it, assuming I'd left it that way earlier, but a strange unease settled in my stomach. Every creak, every shadow seemed amplified. I tried to shake it off. Then came the noises from upstairs. It started as a soft thump, barely audible, like the patter of little feet. At first, I thought it might be Lily stirring, but I could see the light beneath her bedroom door was off. I convinced myself she was still asleep. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then came the whispering. I hesitated before climbing the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The hallway was unnervingly dark, even though the Johnsons had left the hallway light on. I could make out the faint silhouette of Lily's door, closed tight. Yet, the whispering seemed to come from beyond it, soft, breathy voices that made my skin crawl. I knocked gently. "Lily? It's just me." No response. I forced the door open slowly. The room was as I'd left it, her stuffed animals scattered around, the mobile spinning lazily above her crib, but Lily was nowhere to be seen. Panic flared in my chest. I scanned the room, then spotted her small shoes by the closet door, which was slightly cracked open. I pushed it wider, heart pounding. The closet was empty. I called out her name, voice trembling. No answer. I ran downstairs, grabbed my phone, and tried calling the Johnsons, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I noticed the front door, it was unlocked. I cursed myself for trusting them to lock up. I ran outside, scanning the yard and the street, but there was no sign of her. I had to think fast. I called 911, my hands shaking.
911, what's your
The
name?
operator's calm voice was a lifeline, telling me to search the house thoroughly while they dispatched officers. I went back inside, flashlight in hand. I checked every room, every closet, even the basement, but Lily was nowhere to be found. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Then I heard it, the faintest giggle, coming from the attic. My breath caught. The Johnsons' attic was locked, and I hadn't even noticed the key missing from the kitchen hook. I found the key in the back of a kitchen drawer and rushed upstairs. The attic door creaked ominously as I opened it, the smell of dust and old wood hitting me. I shined the flashlight inside. The space was cramped, filled with boxes and cobwebs. For a moment, I thought I'd been imagining it. Then I heard it again, a soft, childish giggle from the far corner. I moved closer, the beam of light trembling. Suddenly, a small hand shot out from behind a stack of boxes, grabbing my wrist. "Lily!" I cried, scooping her up. She was unharmed, but tears streaked down her face, and she clung to me tightly. As I carried her downstairs, I noticed something that chilled me, a message scrawled in red on the attic wall, barely visible in the flashlight's glow. "Thank you for finding me." I called the police again, and when they arrived, I told them everything. The Johnsons came home hours later, frantic and confused, their faces pale when I handed Lily over. No one could explain how she had gotten into the attic, or why the door had been locked. But I knew one thing, I would never babysit in that house again. Something had been there with Lily, something that didn't belong. And I was certain it was still waiting, somewhere in the shadows. The next night, sleep eluded me. Every creak and whisper in my own apartment felt like the house breathing behind my eyelids. I kept thinking about that attic door, the cold, heavy lock, the faint scratch marks around its frame. What had tried to keep itself inside? Or was it waiting for me to return? I tried to convince myself it was over, that the police would keep Lily safe. But deep down, I knew the darkness wasn't bound by locks or doors. It was patient, watching, and somewhere it was already planning its next move. Sleep evaded me, each shadow cast by the street lamp outside twisting into shapes I couldn't unsee. Then, just as dawn threatened the horizon, a faint tapping came, soft, deliberate, at my window. My breath caught. The darkness wasn't done yet. Story 2, Silent Protocol, When Home Turns Hostile. I had never been one for late-night walks, but that Tuesday felt different. The office had been unusually suffocating all day, and the fluorescent lights had gnawed at my nerves until I needed fresh air. It was just past 10 when I stepped out of the building. The street was nearly deserted, the usual drizzle left behind the pavement slick and shimmering under the dim glow of the street lamps. Everything smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. I tucked my hands into my jacket pockets and started down the sidewalk, heading toward the park where I sometimes sat to clear my head. The park was a small patch of green wedged between 2 apartment blocks, equipped with a few benches and a narrow walking path that curved around a playground. At night, it was mostly empty, sometimes used by people walking dogs or couples trying to stretch out the quiet hours. Tonight, though, it was clear. The swings hung still. The slide glistened with droplets. Only one bench was occupied, a man, slouched forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He wore a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. I remember thinking he looked out of place, but I kept walking. The air was colder than I expected. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to focus on the rhythmic sound of my shoes against the wet pavement, but a faint noise caught my attention. Almost like footsteps. Not behind me, but somewhere off to the side, maybe near the line of bushes that bordered the park's edge. I stopped and turned my head slowly. The bushes rustled, a dry, scratching sound, and I thought I caught a glimpse of movement. It was quick, something low and fast, darting out of sight before I could get a clear look. My heartbeat sped up. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably a stray cat or a raccoon. There was a trail behind the park that led to some older residential streets, and I figured whatever it was had slipped through there. I kept walking but tried to stay on the path closest to the street, where the lamps were brighter. The man on the bench was still there, his posture unchanged. It was odd how still he was, like he was waiting for something. I reached the other side of the park and turned onto Maple Street, a narrow, dimly lit road lined with aging houses. Most of the windows were dark, but a few had faint light shining through the curtains. As I walked, I heard the footsteps again, this time definitely behind me. I resisted the urge to glance over my shoulder, but the sound wasn't steady. It seemed to quicken when I slowed and slowed when I picked up pace. My breathing became shallow, and I forced myself to focus on the streetlights ahead. I tried to remind myself that it was probably just someone else out for a late walk. But the feeling of being watched crawled under my skin like a crawling insect. I glanced behind me quickly. A man was there, about 50 or so, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He was walking at a steady pace, hands in his pockets, head down. Nothing overtly threatening, but the way he matched my speed, adjusting whenever I changed pace, made my stomach twist. I picked up my pace, moving closer to the middle of the street. He did the same. A cold knot formed in my gut. I considered crossing to the other side, but the sidewalk was lined with parked cars, and the street lamp on that side flickered intermittently. I felt trapped. I pulled out my phone to check the time. 10:35. The battery was at 50%, which felt both reassuring and inadequate. My fingers trembled slightly, so I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The man didn't break stride. I decided to take a sudden left onto a side street I knew would lead me back toward the main road and, eventually, my apartment. It was quieter there, fewer lights, and more shadows from the overgrown trees lining the sidewalk. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of his face. He had short, graying hair, pale skin, and an expression that was hard to read. His eyes flicked up and met mine for a fraction of a second. There was no smile, no recognition, just a cold, neutral gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. I forced my legs to move faster. The street was longer than I remembered. The trees above blocked most of the light, and the night felt thick around me. The only sound was my breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Then I heard the footsteps again, matching mine, but faster now. My heart pounded, and I couldn't help but look back. The man was less than 10 feet behind me, his pace quickening. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. Branches scraped my arms as I pushed through the overgrowth lining the sidewalk. My breath came in sharp gasps. I didn't know where to run, only that I needed to put as much distance between us as possible. A car passed by on the main road ahead, headlights briefly illuminating the street. Relief flooded me. I shouted toward it, hoping for help, but the driver didn't slow. I glanced back again. The man was still running, his face now set with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I could see his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on me. I reached the end of the street and darted into a small grocery store that was still open, its automatic doors sliding shut behind me. The sudden change of environment shocked my senses, the harsh fluorescent lights, the quiet murmur of a radio, the faint smell of cleaning products. The clerk looked up as I burst through the door, cheeks flushed, hair damp with sweat. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low but concerned. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Someone was following me," I said, barely above a whisper. She glanced out the front window. The street outside was empty again, only the hum of the neon sign buzzing above the door. I stood by the register for a moment, heart still hammering against my ribs. The man hadn't come inside. At least, not yet. I told her I'd call a taxi, but my hands were shaking too much to dial properly. She offered to let me use the phone behind the counter. As I fumbled with the receiver, I glanced back at the window. A shadow moved across the street, too quick and deliberate to be anyone else. I swallowed hard and realized then that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night shift at the diner was usually a slow grind, the kind of place where I could zone out and let the hours slip by without much thought. That night, though, everything felt off from the moment I punched in. The parking lot was emptier than usual, the usual late-night stragglers absent. The fluorescent lights on the sign flickered unevenly, casting weird shadows across the cracked asphalt. I shrugged it off as just one of those things, the kind of minor glitch you get in a place that's been around longer than some of the customers. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and frying grease, but something else was there too, a faint, metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a leak or some old wiring giving off ozone. The clatter of forks and plates was the usual soundtrack, but the silence between the handful of customers was thick, like everyone was holding their breath. Around 10:30, a man came in and slid into the booth I usually kept clear for my breaks. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't look like a regular. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a dark jacket zipped up tight even though it wasn't cold inside. His hair was damp, maybe from rain, and his eyes, I noticed this right away, were too wide, darting around as if he was looking for something or someone. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and stared down into the cup like it was some kind of talisman. I tried to keep my distance, but he kept glancing over at me, waiting for me to say something. When I walked over to clear a table nearby, he nodded politely, but there was a tension in his shoulders that didn't ease up. I asked if he needed anything else, and he shook his head, just saying, "No, thanks," in a voice that was calm but hollow. There was something about the way he spoke, clipped and careful, like he was measuring each word. I went back behind the counter and found myself stealing looks at the clock, trying to inch toward the end of my shift. The man stayed put, nursing that coffee. About 20 minutes later, a couple came in, laughing and talking too loud for the quiet diner. The man in the booth tensed noticeably, his eyes flicking toward the entrance, then back to his cup. He didn't move, but I caught the slight clenching of his jaw. When he finally left, he paid and gave me a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as he walked out into the night. Maybe it was nothing, just a guy passing through, but the feeling stuck with me. I wiped down the counter one more time and tried to shake it off. The regulars slowed down even more after that, and soon it was just me, the cook, and the cleaning crew. Around midnight, I stepped outside for a cigarette break, hoping to clear my head. The air was cold and sharp, and the parking lot looked even emptier in the dark. I noticed a car parked near the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine humming softly. It was an old sedan, the kind that didn't belong to anyone who worked here. I stared at the car, trying to remember if I'd seen it earlier. It wasn't moving, but every few minutes a figure appeared inside, shifting, waiting. I fumbled my phone out of my pocket to check the time and maybe call someone, but the screen was cracked and barely lit up. Just then, I felt something brush against my leg. I jumped and looked down to see a scraggly cat slinking by, disappearing into the shadows near the dumpsters. The motion made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I hurried back inside. Back under the harsh diner lights, the atmosphere felt suffocating. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the car was probably just someone waiting for a friend or making a delivery. But the way that man had looked at me earlier, like he was searching for a face in the crowd, stuck in my mind. As the clock edged past 1 a.m., the cleaning crew finished up and left. The cook was wiping down the grill, humming softly, and I kept glancing at the door. The hum of the old neon sign outside buzzed unevenly, drowning in the dark silence beyond the windows. Then, I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the glass, at the edge of the parking lot. A figure, standing completely still, watching. I blinked hard, told myself it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked back, the figure was closer. Not running, not hiding, just there. I froze, the weight of every eye on me suddenly unbearable. The cook glanced up, following my gaze, but shrugged and went back to his work. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my ears. Minutes passed like hours. The figure didn't leave. I debated calling the police, but the fear of looking over my shoulder stopped me. What if it was nothing? What if I looked ridiculous? I felt trapped in that little bubble of light and grease, the silent watcher just beyond the glass. Finally, after what felt like forever, headlights flickered on in the parking lot. The figure moved back into the shadows, disappearing as a car pulled in near the entrance. A couple of other late-night customers stepped inside, breaking the spell. The relief was immediate but shallow. I kept watching the windows the rest of the night, heart hammering with every passing second. When dawn finally came, the sun slicing through the grime-smeared windows, I locked up the diner and stepped out into the cold light of morning. The sedan was gone, the parking lot empty again except for the old cat, which watched me from a distance before disappearing into the grass. I felt the eyes of the night still on me, heavy and waiting, even in the light. I knew then this wasn't over. Whatever had been out there, watching, waiting, it was still out there. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I had never been good at reading people. I always assumed most strangers were just passing through their day, not paying much mind to anyone else around them. That night, though, as I sat in my car outside the 24-hour laundromat on the edge of town, I realized how wrong I'd been. It was just past midnight. The streetlights flickered unevenly along the cracked pavement, and a sharp wind had picked up, rattling the chain-link fence that lined the lot. I was folding my clothes on the passenger seat, trying not to get frostbite through the thin fabric of my jacket. The little heater inside the car was barely enough to keep the chill off, but it was better than standing outside. The laundromat was empty except for one other patron. A man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, sat in the corner by the vending machines. His clothes were loose and worn, and a gray knit cap covered most of his head. He kept glancing at me every few minutes and then looking away, like he was trying to keep his eyes casual but couldn't stop himself. I tried not to notice, telling myself I was imagining things, that he was just bored or waiting for something. I folded a t-shirt carefully, my fingers trembling slightly, when I saw him stand up and head toward the door. For a moment, I thought he might leave, and relief hit me like a wave. But no, he lingered just outside the glass, standing under the harsh sodium glow of a street lamp, watching me through the window. I swallowed hard and locked the doors, even though they were already locked. The car's central locking beeped faintly, and I could hear the faint crunch of gravel as something shifted just beyond the glass. My breath fogged the inside of the window as I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to see his face clearly. He was watching me, motionless, like some predator waiting for the right moment to move. A sudden noise, a car door slamming across the street, snapped my head around. The man was gone. I blinked, scanning the lot frantically. The fence rattled again, and I saw him, crouching now behind a beat-up sedan parked a few spots down. Panic flooded my chest. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and peeled out of the lot, tires skidding on gravel. As I turned right onto the main road, my heart hammered so loudly it drowned out the engine. My hand shook, gripping the wheel as I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. The lot was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia. Maybe he'd left when I did. Or maybe he was waiting for someone else. The truth was, I had no idea. The car behind me was just a shadow now, but my mind filled in all the worst possibilities. I passed the red light at the intersection, the glow casting a red smear across my windshield. Up ahead, the road narrowed and twisted, running alongside the river where there were no streetlights for miles. It was a shortcut I took sometimes when I was rushing home, lonely, but faster. I debated turning around, but the idea of going back to that laundromat unsettled me even more. I stayed the course, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. Halfway down the river road, my headlights caught a figure standing by the edge of the asphalt. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He didn't move as I approached, just stood there, staring out toward the water. I slowed down but didn't stop. If I did, I told myself, maybe he'd step onto the road. Maybe he'd do something. I couldn't risk it. The man's head snapped toward me suddenly, and for a heart-stopping instant, I saw the whites of his eyes reflected in the glass. He raised a hand slowly, and I swore it looked like a wave, but the smile that followed was too wide, too wrong. I slammed the gas pedal and sped past him, the tires kicking up gravel and dirt. My ears rang from the blast of wind through my cracked window, and I didn't breathe again until I turned onto the well-lit Main Street. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was still open. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly pink glow over the empty lot. Inside, the smell of greasy coffee and fried eggs hit me hard, and I took a seat at the counter, trying to calm down. The waitress, a heavy-set woman with a permanent scowl, slid a cup of coffee in front of me without a word. I nodded thanks and stared out the window. The street outside was deserted, not a soul in sight. As I sipped the bitter coffee, my phone buzzed. I fished it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have left." My heart stopped. The diner suddenly felt claustrophobic, like all the walls were closing in. I looked around, half expecting to find the man from the river road standing behind me, grinning that terrible smile. I locked my phone and stuffed it in my pocket, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? That some guy had been watching me at the laundromat, then standing by the road, then sent me a threatening text? Without any proof, I'd sound crazy. After paying for my coffee, I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the neon glow. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. I got back in the car and started the engine, the heater struggling to warm the cabin. The streets were empty as I drove home, each red light stretching longer than the last. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I locked every door and window before slipping inside. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had happened was just a coincidence, some random stranger being creepy. But deep down, I knew the truth was darker. Someone was watching me, and they weren't done yet. That night, I left every light on. Even with the lamps blazing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting just beyond the walls. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was a warning. And I was running out of places to hide. The rain started just as I was locking the door to the grocery store. It was a late Thursday night, just past midnight, and the streets were slick, reflecting the neon signs like puddles of melted color. I had volunteered to cover the graveyard shift alone, something I'd agreed to only because no one else wanted to. I told myself it was a quiet night ahead, just me, the fluorescent hum of the overhead lights, and the endless aisles of canned beans and frozen pizzas. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I stepped outside. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic like blood, but I tried to brush that thought away. I glanced down the street, the usual deserted stretch of storefronts and darkened windows. No cars, no people. Only the occasional drip of water from a leaky drain pipe. I started toward my car, my boots tapping softly against the pavement. My mind drifted to the small apartment I'd just moved into a few weeks ago, a cramped two-bedroom above a laundromat in a neighborhood that hadn't quite figured out if it wanted to gentrify or decay. The building's paint was peeling, the front steps cracked, but I liked it. It felt like a fresh start, even if there was a faint undercurrent of unease I couldn't quite place. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, hands slick with rain. That's when I noticed a man. He was standing under the dim glow of a street lamp about 30 feet down the block, just outside the entrance to a shuttered cafe. Nothing remarkable about his appearance: jeans, a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, but something about the way he stood still, watching the empty street, made my skin prickle. I looked away quickly, pretending to check my phone, but my heart was already picking up pace. I told myself he was just waiting for a ride or maybe a friend. But as I unlocked the door and slid inside the car, I couldn't shake the feeling he was watching me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and glanced in the rearview mirror. His figure was a shadow now, but I caught a glint of something pale, maybe the edge of a phone screen illuminating his face briefly as he looked down. The street was deserted, but as I backed out slowly, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, engine off, headlights dim. The windows were tinted, but I thought I saw movement inside. I swallowed hard and tapped the horn twice, half expecting the occupants to scatter. But the car remained motionless, as if waiting. I decided not to take the usual route home. Instead of turning right toward the highway, I went left, onto a side road lined with warehouses. The rain intensified, hammering the windshield like a drum. The streetlights here were sporadic, some flickering, some dead. I passed an open loading dock with stacks of crates piled high, their shadows stretching like fingers into the night. The black sedan appeared again, this time parked a few blocks behind me. It crept forward each time I slowed, keeping pace without overtaking. My chest tightened. I wanted to convince myself it was a coincidence, but my rational mind was drowning beneath a rising tide of panic. I tried calling my roommate, but the phone buzzed with no service. I cursed under my breath and glanced at the gas gauge. Half a tank, not enough to get far if I needed to run. I made a quick decision to pull into a 24-hour gas station ahead, hoping for crowds or at least a clerk who could help. The gas station was nearly empty, one flickering fluorescent light above the entrance, and an old man behind the counter who barely looked up as I entered. I filled the tank quickly, every second feeling like an eternity. The black sedan was nowhere in sight. Maybe I'd lost it. I was just about to pay when I noticed movement in the corner of the lot. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was crouching by a motorcycle parked near the far pumps. He wore a leather jacket and a dark beanie, and his face was shadowed. Something about the way he was crouched, like he was trying to stay out of sight, made my skin crawl. I looked back toward the cashier. The old man was still focused on the TV behind the counter, oblivious to the figure outside. I debated going back inside but decided instead to get in my car and lock the doors. As I pulled away, I caught the man's eyes briefly. They were cold, hard, and fixed on me. I pressed the accelerator, heart slamming against my ribs. I took the highway this time, hoping the speed in traffic would shake whoever was following me. The rain slowed to a mist, but the streetlights blurred into streaks. Cars passed by, but I felt isolated, like I was the only living thing moving through a silent, indifferent world. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated the black sedan again, looming in the distance, now clearly following. I flicked the brights on and off, hoping to signal distress, but the driver didn't react. It stayed locked onto my tail like a predator. I exited at the next off-ramp, driving toward the nearest police station, only to find the lot deserted and gates locked for the night. The sense of isolation deepened. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "You shouldn't have left." The words flashed on the screen, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect, just a dead, monotonous tone. I looked in the rearview mirror again. The black sedan was closer now, the headlights dimmed, creeping up behind me like it was ready to strike. I forced my hands to steady the wheel, breathing shallow and fast. Ahead, a gas station appeared bright, crowded, a beacon of safety. I sped toward it, praying it was open. As I pulled into the lot, my foot hit the brake hard and the car skidded slightly on the wet pavement. I locked the doors and bolted inside, heart hammering so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. The place was nearly empty, but a security camera above the register flickered, and the clerk gave me a quick, worried glance. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice low. I think someone's following me," I managed to say, voice trembling. "I need to stay here, just for a bit." He nodded slowly and moved to the door, locking it behind me. The fluorescent lights hummed too loud, and the rain pounded on the roof. Outside, the black sedan circled the lot once, then disappeared into the night. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. Safe, for now. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the night closed in again. The rain had started just after I left the cafe, a slow drizzle that thickened into a steady patter against the sidewalk and my umbrella. I pulled the collar of my jacket tighter around my neck, feeling the chill creep in despite the layers. The streets were quieter than usual for a Friday night, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace but waiting, like everything was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the weather keeping people indoors, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. I was walking home from my shift at the bookstore, the one on the edge of downtown. The area wasn't known for trouble, but it wasn't exactly safe either, enough drunks and drifters on weekend nights to make you keep your head on a swivel. I stuck to the main roads, avoiding the narrow alleys and side streets where the streetlights burned out months ago. The rain made the pavement slick and shiny, headlights and neon signs reflected like shattered glass. My footsteps echoed lightly behind me, but when I glanced back, no one was there. At least, not at first. About 3 blocks from the corner where I would turn onto my street, I noticed a figure step out of a doorway ahead. A man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie that masked half his face. He paused under a broken street lamp, the puddles around his feet rippling in the rain. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down the street toward me. I stopped, not wanting to make eye contact but also not wanting to ignore him. His face was shadowed, but from what I could see, his eyes flicked sharply over me, like he was debating something. I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone waiting for a ride, or just sheltering from the rain. I kept walking, but my steps slowed, and my heart started thudding painfully in my chest. The man moved with me, keeping a distance but matching my pace. Every time I glanced back, his head would jerk away, like he didn't want me to see him watching. The street was deserted except for the occasional flicker of an old television screen glowing through a window or the hum of a distant car engine. The rain was heavier now, the cold penetrating through my jacket and soaking my jeans. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying not to panic. I wondered if I should cross the street, call someone, or just keep going and hope he lost interest. None of it seemed like a real option. When I was just a block from my apartment building, the man stepped off the sidewalk and onto the street, blocking my path. My breath caught. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and for the first time, I noticed the thin scar running from his left temple down to his jawline. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low and rough. "I don't want to hurt you." My mouth went dry. I had no idea what to say, or if I should run, scream, or pretend I didn't hear him. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting his face alternately in shadow and pale light. I could make out the tension in his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders. "Just don't scream," he added, stepping closer. "I just want to talk." I shook my head, trying to back up, but the cold wet pavement made my feet slip. I stumbled, and his hand shot out, gripping my wrist firmly but not harshly. The rain mixed with the sweat on my skin, making the moment feel surreal. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. He hesitated, then released my wrist and stepped back. "I'm sorry. I'm not going to hurt you. I just needed to know something." My heart was racing, my mind scrambling for any explanation. "What?" He glanced down the street toward the corner. "Have you seen her? A girl about your height, red hair? She's been missing around here." His words didn't ease my fear. If anything, they made it worse. I realized then that the man wasn't some random mugger or drifter, but someone connected to something darker, maybe a stalker, someone desperate, dangerous. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling my arm free and moving past him. "I don't know anyone like that." He didn't follow. For a moment, I thought he might, but he just watched me go, head tilted as if considering a different plan. I ran the last block home, fumbling with my keys in the rain. The apartment door slammed shut behind me, and I leaned against it, gasping. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my umbrella. I heard a faint tapping on the window above the door, just rain, I hoped. But my pulse was still pounding, and the feeling that I was being watched didn't fade. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the building sounded like footsteps. Every shadow beyond the curtains was a figure waiting. When morning came, I checked the local news. Nothing about a missing girl, no alerts or warnings. But I knew what I saw was real. The man, the scar, the way he moved. That day, I didn't leave my apartment. Not until I had a plan. I tore through my old notebooks, searching for any clue about that scarred man. There had to be a pattern, a name, something linking him to this town. As twilight bled through the window, a faint knock echoed from the door. My breath hitched. No one knew I was here. No one should. Story 3, Silent Battalion, The Last Command. I never imagined that the last thing I'd hear before everything went wrong would be the quiet static of a radio transmission, barely audible through the thick fog that had settled around our perimeter. We had been stationed in a remote part of Eastern Europe, a place no one really cared about except for the fact that it held some strategic value nobody seemed willing to explain to us. Our mission was clear but vague: observe, report, and hold position until further orders. What those orders would be, no one knew. It was late October, the kind of cold that seeps in not just through your clothes but into your bones, making every movement sluggish and every breath visible. The days blended into one another: foggy mornings, gray afternoons, and nights so black they swallowed the weak beam of our flashlights whole. The landscape was a desolate stretch of forest, dotted with dead trees whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The soil was damp and soft underfoot, muffling our steps but also turning an ordinary walk into a slow, cautious slog. Our unit consisted of 12 men, all of us relatively new to this assignment. The commanding officer, Captain Merrick, was a man of few words, his face weathered but unreadable. He kept us on a tight schedule, drilling us on perimeter defenses and radio protocols. There was an unspoken tension among us. None of us wanted to admit that the entire assignment felt off, as if we'd been sent to wait for something no one wanted to talk about. I was the radio operator, a job that made me the first to pick up on anomalies. My gear was a vintage PRC-77, bulky and outdated, but it was what we had. I remember the moment it started, the faint buzzing and crackling that didn't match any known frequency. At first, I thought it was just interference from the terrain or some malfunction, but the sound lingered, persistent and almost deliberate. It happened on the 5th night of our deployment. The fog had thickened that evening, reducing visibility to mere meters. I was alone, stationed at the relay point about a kilometer from the main camp. My fingers hovered over the radio controls, adjusting the squelch to cut out the static. Then, through the white noise, a voice broke through. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Are you there? Can you hear me?" I froze, gripping the handset tighter. The voice was fragmented, distant, but real. It wasn't any of ours, and the frequency was one we hadn't been assigned to monitor. I pressed the button to transmit, my voice coming out shaky and uncertain. "This is Echo 3. Identify yourself." Silence. Then the crackle resumed, and I thought I heard a faint breath, as if someone was just beyond the edge of comprehension, trapped between transmission and reception. I wanted to call for backup, to report this to Captain Merrick, but something about the moment held me in place. The silence stretched until I finally decided to shut the radio down and return to camp. When I got back, the men were gathered around a small fire. Their faces looked drawn, shadows playing tricks in the flickering light. I told Merrick about the transmission. He listened, his jaw tight, before dismissing it as interference. "Probably a trap or a malfunction," he said. But I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. That night, none of us slept well. Someone whispered about strange noises in the woods, whispers without source, footsteps that stopped when approached. When dawn finally broke, the fog remained thick and oppressive like a shroud. The next days were a blur of tension. I kept scanning frequencies, hoping to catch another transmission, but the radio stayed silent. Still, the feeling that we were being watched never left. The soldiers became jumpy, rifles clutched tighter, eyes darting into the tree line. Supplies began to run low, and contact with base was spotty at best, another reason to suspect the radio interference was more than just atmospheric. On the 7th night, things escalated. We were alerted by a series of shots, sharp, erratic, not the controlled bursts of any of our men. Captain Merrick ordered us to arms and to hold position, but the shots came from outside the perimeter. I remember the cold sinking deeper as we gathered, listening to the forest erupt in chaos. Then came the screams, harsh, guttural, inhuman. We never found out exactly what happened. By morning, 2 of our men were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty spaces where they'd been standing. The survivors were pale, eyes white with a terror that couldn't be named. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize it as an enemy ambush or a wild animal attack. But the radio started up again that night, that same voice breaking through the static. Help us. It wasn't a plea from the missing men. It was something else entirely, something that carried a weight beyond fear or desperation. Captain Merrick was at a loss. We had no reinforcements, no extraction plan. We were isolated, trapped in a nightmare that was unfolding layer by layer, and it was only just beginning. The static thickened, swirling into a chorus of whispers beneath that single desperate phrase, help us. Our minds raced, but the forest held its silence, watching. The morning air was sharp and cold, slicing through my jacket the moment I stepped outside the barracks. I kept my head down, boots crunching on the gravel as I made my way toward the mess hall. The dark sky still held the faintest trace of dawn, but the cloud cover was thick and gray, swallowing the horizon. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't the only one moving quietly through the camp. Shadows of men and women, all just as subdued, all wrapped in the same tension that had settled after last night. I could still taste the metallic tang of fear from what we'd seen. The blackened remains of the reconnaissance team's last position were fresh in my mind, even as the base's usual hum of activity tried to mask it. But no one spoke openly about what had happened out there. The official reports were sanitized and vague, full of phrases like unidentified threat and operational anomaly. The more they tried to keep it under wraps, the more it gnawed at us. The clang of the mess hall door jolted me from my thoughts. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. A few soldiers sat in silence, eating their rations with mechanical movements. I spotted Corporal Jensen by the coffee machine, his face pale and eyes darting like he hadn't slept. I joined him, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse. He glanced up, offering a quick nod. "What's your read on last night?" I shook my head. "I don't know." Whatever it wasn't like anything we've trained for. Jensen's hand trembled slightly as he poured coffee. "I'm telling you, it wasn't just some enemy patrol. Not with the way they moved. No human could survive that." I stared at the dark liquid, swirling in the cup. There was a silence between us, filled only by the distant clatter of boots and muffled voices coming from outside. We were supposed to be a well-oiled machine, a disciplined regiment ready for anything. But last night's mission had shattered that illusion. The team sent out to retrieve the missing squad had returned empty-handed, their radios dead. The only thing they brought back was a series of static-laden transmissions and a handful of broken equipment. And worse, the air was thick with an unspoken dread. I left Jensen and headed toward the command tent. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Major Caldwell stood over a table strewn with maps and satellite images, his normally composed demeanor cracking at the edges. He caught my eye and waved me over. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice low but urgent. "I need you to review the latest intel. The situation is escalating faster than we anticipated." I nodded, stepping closer. He pointed to a section of the map where recent sensor readings had spiked. "There's something out there," Caldwell said. "Something that's not on any of our databases. It's interfering with our comms and disabling our drones. We're losing eyes and ears." I traced the area with my finger. The terrain was dense forest and rolling hills, nothing unusual. Yet whatever was out there had managed to turn our technological advantages into liabilities. Have there been any casualties? I asked. Caldwell's jaw clenched. Several missing, presumed dead. We're scrambling to contain the threat, but every time we send a unit in, they don't come back. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The thought of sending more men into that unknown darkness felt like a death sentence. But orders were orders. Do we have any leads on what it might be? I pressed. Caldwell looked away, his eyes shadowed. Nothing concrete. Some of the readings suggest electromagnetic interference, but that doesn't explain the physical damage to equipment. The terrain reports show no signs of natural disaster or enemy fortifications. My mind raced through possibilities: enemy experimental weapons, an undiscovered weapon platform, or something entirely new. The thought that this might be something beyond human was starting to feel less like paranoia and more like reality. I left the command tent with a renewed sense of urgency gnawing at my core. Every instinct screamed that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than a conventional threat. Walking back through the camp, I noticed the subtle changes in behavior, the way people glanced over their shoulders, the whispers that ceased when I approached, the sudden tightening of ranks. Back at my quarters, I sat on the narrow cot and stared at the cracked window, the forest outside seeming to press in closer. The night was coming again, and with it, the unknown. I thought about the missing men, the shattered radios, the blackouts on our surveillance feeds. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. We were no longer just soldiers fighting an enemy. We were pawns in something much darker, something that thrived in silence and shadows. That night, as I lay awake listening to the wind moan through the trees, the faintest sound caught my attention. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like distant machinery vibrating beneath the earth. I sat up, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The base was supposed to be secure, but the forest beyond was alive with secrets. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin. The camp lights flickered, casting long shadows that merged with the darkness beyond the perimeter fence. Moving carefully, I followed the hum toward the tree line. As I reached the edge of the clearing, the sound intensified, a mechanical drone layered with something else, something organic and rhythmic. My breath caught in my throat. The trees ahead rustled, though the night was still. Shapes shifted between the trunks, silhouettes that didn't quite belong. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed out, followed by a guttural noise that wasn't human. I froze, heart pounding, flashlight beam trembling in my grip. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a menace that defied explanation. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the forest fell silent. I stumbled back toward the safety of the base, the image of those shifting shadows seared into my mind. Whatever was out there, it wasn't waiting for us to find it. It was waiting for us to make a mistake. And I was beginning to fear that mistake would come all too soon. The morning air was sharp, biting into the skin beneath my thinning jacket as I trudged through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving base. The sun, pale and hesitant behind thick, gray clouds, did little to warm the damp earth beneath my boots. Each step stirred the scent of rust and decay, a metallic tang I couldn't forget, no matter how far I moved away. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy, as if the walls themselves held their breath. I had been here before, only hours earlier, but the place had changed overnight. Not physically, nothing had moved or shifted, but the atmosphere had thickened, a suffocating presence that didn't belong. I tried to rationalize it, told myself I was just tired, that my imagination was running wild after all the things I'd seen and heard. But deep down, I knew better. The base, once a sprawling, secure military installation, had been abandoned abruptly. I heard rumors from locals, strange experiments, classified projects, personnel disappearing without trace. I never put much stock in hearsay until I was assigned to document the site. Officially, it was a routine survey, a cleanup assessment before the demolition teams arrived. Unofficially, I think someone wanted the truth buried with the base. The command center was my destination. The building stood isolated, its concrete walls cracked and stained by years of neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly as a cold breeze slipped through the gap. Inside, the stale air burned my nostrils, thick with dust and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood, but I saw no sign of it. Rows of monitors lined the far wall, their screens shattered or coated in grime. In the center of the room was a long table cluttered with old documents, maps, and electronic components that had long since lost power. I flipped through a yellowed notebook, its pages brittle and stained. The handwriting was neat, clinical, but the entries became increasingly erratic, the words blurring into desperate scribbles. Day 47, Subject 42A shows signs of increased aggression. Containment protocols failing. Sedatives ineffective. Personnel injuries rising. My heart quickened. Subject 42A. The code had come up in whispers during briefings, always heavily redacted. No one would tell me what it was. But here, among these forsaken pages, the truth began to unravel. I heard a faint noise behind me, a subtle shift of weight on cracked linoleum. I spun around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but saw nothing. The hair at the back of my neck prickled. I told myself it was just the wind or rats or the building settling after decades of abandonment. I set the notebook down and moved toward the hallway beyond the command center. The corridor was narrow, the walls lined with peeling paint and exposed wiring. Flickers of light from my flashlight revealed smashed lockers and discarded uniforms. Then I saw it, a smear of dark red on the floor, glossy and fresh-looking despite the years that had passed here. It stretched toward a heavy steel door marked laboratory. The air grew colder. I hesitated, the primal part of my brain screaming to retreat, but curiosity and some stubborn sense of duty pushed me forward. The door was locked, the handle stiff and chilled. I pulled my multi-tool, pried at the edges, and with a sharp crack, it gave way. The door swung open, revealing a room bathed in shadow and silence. Inside, the walls were lined with cabinets and work tables, each surface cluttered with instruments that looked both familiar and grotesque. Glass vials, some cracked and oozing dark fluid, lay scattered amid papers and broken syringes. Computers sat dormant, their screens cracked but still faintly glowing with residual charge. Then I heard the hum, a low, mechanical vibration from beneath the floor. The hum grew steadily louder, reverberating through the soles of my boots. I felt it in my chest, a dissonant rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. I followed the sound to a grated vent embedded in the floor, its metal rusted but intact. Kneeling, I shone my light down the narrow shaft. The darkness seemed bottomless. I reached out, fingers brushing against cold metal pipes and cables. Suddenly, the crate vibrated violently beneath my touch. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, as a guttural noise echoed up from the depths, an inhuman growl, raw and desperate. The sound shattered the suffocating silence like glass breaking. I scrambled to my feet and back toward the door, tripping over debris. The growl intensified, joined by a wet, slithering sound that made my skin crawl. Something was down there, something alive. I slammed the door shut behind me and pressed my back against it, breathing hard. In the faint glow of my flashlight, I saw the smeared red streaks had multiplied, crawling up the walls like veins. My mind raced. The experiments, they hadn't just failed. They had broken something loose. Something the military tried to hide. The base wasn't abandoned to neglect or budget cuts. It was abandoned because what they created was still here, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. I had to get out. But as I moved toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of movement through the cracked windows, shadows flickering just beyond the tree line, watching. The military's horror wasn't gone. It was alive, and it was hunting. The air inside the bunker was colder than I remembered, the kind of cold that slid under your skin and settled in your bones. I pulled my jacket tighter as I stepped through the jagged entrance, the flickering emergency lights casting long, uneasy shadows on the concrete walls. This place hadn't changed, but I had, and not for the better. The quiet hum of forgotten machinery was the only sound, a low droning that seemed almost alive, breathing with the building itself. I hadn't meant to come back. Not really. But after everything that happened, after the reports were buried and the official documents were erased, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The military brass called it an incident. A containment failure. But the truth was far worse, and they made sure no one ever talked about what happened to the men in the 12th Company. My footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor, the sound bouncing back at me from the steel-reinforced walls. I counted the doors as I passed. Each room had been sealed off, locks welded shut after the evacuation. They wanted to keep whatever was in here contained, invisible, and silent. But I knew better. I knew what had been unleashed. The last time I was here, I'd been part of that company. I remembered the unease in the air, the subtle way the men shifted when we were near the containment chamber. It was like the place was breathing, watching us. I still couldn't explain the sudden drops in temperature or the muffled noises that no one else ever seemed to hear. But now, standing here alone, the silence was suffocating. I reached the intersection where the containment chamber was located. The thick blast doors still loomed ahead, scarred from the desperate attempts to seal them shut during the evacuation. I reached out and pressed my palm against the cold surface. The steel vibrated faintly, almost like a heartbeat. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Part of me wanted to turn back, but the other part, a darker, more stubborn part, pushed forward. I found the emergency override panel beside the door, its buttons cracked and worn. I fumbled with the codes I remembered, hesitating only for a moment before the lights above the panel flickered green. The blast doors groaned as they began to inch open, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. Inside, the air was thick with a metallic tang, the smell of ozone and something fouler I couldn't place. The chamber was vast, lined with rows of heavy equipment and containment units. Most of them were shattered or empty, their contents either destroyed or missing. But at the center stood the main containment pod, a massive cylindrical tank filled with a murky liquid. I stepped closer, the light from the chamber casting eerie reflections on the surface. The pod's control panel was offline, cracked and sparking in places. I tried to find a power source, but the entire system seemed dead, as if the heart of this place had stopped beating long ago. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from inside the pod. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my ear against the cold glass, and the sound grew louder. It wasn't just tapping, it was a pattern, like Morse code, a staccato message trying to break through the silence. I reached for my radio, my hands trembling. "Command, this is Sergeant Mitchell. I'm inside the containment chamber. Possible sign of life in the main pod. Requesting immediate extraction." Static answered me. No reply. I cursed under my breath and tried again, punching the frequency with more insistence. Still nothing. Whatever signal I was sending was being swallowed by the bunker's thick walls. Then the tapping stopped. A heavy silence fell, so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I stepped back, my mind racing. Could something still be alive in here? I thought of Daniels and the other men who had disappeared that night, swallowed whole by whatever had been released from that pod. The official report said they were lost to an explosion. I knew the truth was far darker. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air. The pod's liquid began to ripple, as if something beneath the surface was moving. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. Then I saw it, eyes. Pale, unblinking eyes, glowing faintly beneath the murky liquid. They fixed on me, unyielding and cold. I turned and ran, the echoing footsteps behind me impossible to ignore. The bunker seemed to twist and shift, the corridors elongating and narrowing as I fled. The emergency lights blinked out one by one, plunging me into darkness. I reached for my flashlight, its beam weak but enough to cut through the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, and I knew I wasn't alone. I burst through the bunker's exit, gasping for air as the cold night slammed into me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew, deep down, the nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Whatever had been in that pod had followed me back into the world, and it was waiting. Watching. Still hungry. I stumbled forward, heart hammering, shadows twisting around me like living things. The air tasted thick, ominous, whispering promises of horrors yet to come. The days blurred together in a mess of cold sweat and restless nights. I kept waking up with my heart pounding, the echo of distant gunfire still ringing in my ears. The base was quieter now, but the silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm I couldn't see. The men were on edge. Whispers bounced off the steel walls about strange sightings beyond the perimeter, shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. Nobody wanted to talk about it openly, but we all knew something was wrong. I told myself to stay focused, to trust the training that had gotten me through worse, but every instinct screamed that we were already too deep into something we couldn't control. The higher-ups sent patrols out every few hours, but their reports came back vague and uneasy, describing nothing but empty woods and an unsettling feeling, like ice watching from the dark. 2 mornings ago, Lieutenant Harris disappeared. He went out on a routine recon, just a quick sweep to check the eastern ridge, and never returned. His radio went silent within the first 20 minutes. We organized a search party, combed the area with flashlights and night vision, but there was no trace of him, no footprints, no blood, no evidence that he had even been there. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. That was when the edge of paranoia started to cut deeper. I kept hearing noises in the distance, low, guttural growls that couldn't be animals. My rifle felt heavier, my senses sharper, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching us, learning us, waiting. Yesterday, I was on watch duty near the eastern fence line when the power flickered and died. The generator sputtered and went offline without warning, plunging the entire base into darkness. The backup lights kicked on, but their glow was pale and weak, barely enough to see the shadows twitching just beyond the barbed wire. I radioed the control tower, but all I got was static. The comms were down. I could hear something moving in the brush outside, slow and deliberate steps crunching through the dry leaves. I gripped my rifle tighter, calling out through the dark, but the only answer was a low, breathless hiss that made my blood run cold. I fired 3 shots into the trees, but the noise stopped. There was nothing. No return fire, no fallen bodies, just silence. When the lights finally flickered back on an hour later, the patrols reported no intruders. Yet, Lieutenant Daniels came in from his post pale and shaken, swearing he saw a figure standing just beyond the fence, watching us with eyes that glowed brighter than any torch. We tried to laugh it off, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear none of us wanted to admit. Last night, I barely slept. I checked and rechecked my weapon, cleaned the scope until my fingers ached, and sat by the window in the guard tower listening. The forest was alive with whispers, the wind carrying faint voices that sounded almost human, but distorted. I kept thinking about Harris and Daniels and all the others who'd been changed by this place. The morning came too fast. Orders came down to prepare for immediate evacuation. The brass claimed there was a breach in containment, though they refused to say what had been released or escaped. We were to pack light and move out as soon as the transport arrived. I packed my gear methodically, but my hands trembled. There was a heaviness in my chest, a feeling that leaving meant abandoning something far worse than any enemy. The base was a cage, but out there in the woods, the unknown waited. As I stepped outside, the sun barely pierced the thick canopy overhead. I caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line, just a fleeting shadow, but it was enough. I tightened my grip on my rifle and scanned the horizon, knowing that whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let us go quietly. The helicopter thundered overhead, a welcome sound that didn't bring relief. I climbed aboard last, looking back once more at the base sinking into silence. The rot had already set in, and I knew that leaving didn't mean the nightmare was over. It was just beginning. The hum of the blades masked the distant, guttural growl that shredded the night air, a sound too deep, too raw to belong to any known animal. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the helicopter's frame, eyes locked on the darkening tree line, where the shadows twisted and pulsed unnaturally. The others whispered, their voices taut with exhaustion and dread, but I barely heard them. My mind was a storm of fragmented memories, flashing images of empty bunkers, blood-stained walls, and those eyes, unblinking, watching. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms, urging us to hold tight. Below, the ground seemed to writhe, as if alive, swallowing the base whole. A sudden jolt shook the craft, and the faint glow of something alive erupted from the forest's edge. An unnatural light, sickly and green, spilled upward like the breath of a corpse rising. Panic clawed at my chest. We hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever had hunted us was now airborne, shadowing us in the sky. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. The nightmare was no longer behind us. It was circling, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Story 4, Beneath the Quiet Pines. The night shift started like every other Thursday night at the lakeside gas and deli. Around 6 p.m., I clocked in, flipped on the fluorescent lights, and ran my fingers over the counter, clearing away some crumbs from the day's lunch rush. The place was quiet except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator and a clock ticking somewhere behind the wall. Outside, a mist had settled low over the highway, the way it did this time of year. I liked it about fall, the way the air felt thick and cool, full of distant smells like damp leaves and exhaust fumes. I usually wasn't bothered by working alone overnight. Even on weekends, the customers thinned out after 9, leaving me to restock shelves or mop floors in the fading hours. I kept a radio on low volume at the counter to keep myself company, tuning into a local talk station where callers shared weather complaints or neighborhood gossip. Nothing ever felt urgent or threatening, just the hum of ordinary life. That night, I pulled the deli case door shut and glanced at the clock. 10:15. I was about to start wiping down the soda coolers when a customer walked in, a man, maybe in his late 20s, his jacket zipped all the way up despite the heat inside. His hair was wet, and he had that restless energy people get when they've been driving too long or running from something. He didn't go straight to the aisles like most people. Instead, he stood just inside the door, staring out into the parking lot. I caught him watching the road, then glancing back at me several times. There was something off about the way he shifted his weight, like he was waiting for someone or something. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned sharply, as if caught off guard. "No, just grabbing a bottle of water," he said, voice low and a little tight. He moved quickly, picking up a plastic bottle from the cooler near the door. I watched him glance again out the windows, this time with a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. Maybe I was just imagining things, but his eyes darted like he was worried about being seen, or about who might be outside. The doorbell jingled twice in quick succession. I looked up. A woman walked in, carrying a small backpack and wearing a knitted cap pulled low over her forehead. She didn't smile, didn't look at me, just headed straight to the restroom in the back. I frowned. The restroom was usually empty at this hour. I went back to wiping down the soda coolers but kept an eye on the man. He was now near the back aisles, fiddling with the label on a box of granola bars. His hands trembled slightly. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman come out of the restroom, pausing at the entrance like she was listening. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the store with a tense expression, then moved toward the snacks aisle, which was near where the man stood. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, like the air had thickened. Something wasn't right. The man and woman ended up standing no more than 10 feet apart, neither making a move to leave. I felt the urge to approach them, to ask if everything was okay, but I hesitated. The man's eyes met mine briefly, and I caught the faintest glimpse of a bruise just below his left eye. The woman's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. I returned behind the counter and called out, "If you need anything, just let me know." Neither answered. They both looked away, the silence stretching out, heavy and awkward. My heart started pounding louder. Something about the way they lingered, the way they avoided each other's gazes, felt like the opening scene of a bad situation. Then, the lights flickered. I flinched, glancing up at the ceiling. The old wiring in the building was notorious for acting up during storms, but the night was clear, the rain only a distant memory from earlier in the day. I reached for the circuit breaker box behind the counter, but before I could move, the power went out entirely. The fluorescent lights died, plunging the store into darkness. The emergency exit sign buzzed faintly overhead, casting a weak red glow across the aisles. My phone was in my pocket, but the screen was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it during my shift. "Hey," I said, voice shaking a little, "are you two okay?" "It's just a blackout. Power should be back soon." The man didn't respond. Instead, he started moving toward the door, but then stopped, looking over his shoulder. The woman followed behind him, her footsteps slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and flipped it on, the beam slicing through the dark. The light caught their faces, tense, eyes darting, alert. Neither of them made a sound. Suddenly, the man pulled a small object from his jacket pocket, a keychain or maybe a slim knife, I couldn't tell, and held it out in front of him like a shield or weapon. My breath caught. This wasn't just a blackout anymore. Something was very wrong. I backed away slowly, fumbling for the door lock. My hands trembled as I turned the key and yanked the door open. A cold rush of night air spilled inside, carrying the faint echo of distant cars and the crunch of gravel underfoot. The two didn't move immediately. Then, as if deciding against confrontation, they slipped out into the parking lot, disappearing into the fog. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, chest heaving, every nerve on edge. Outside, the night was quiet again. The mist curled low across the asphalt, swallowing the distant headlights of passing cars. But inside me, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond sight, stayed alive. I didn't know what those two wanted or why they were there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe, not yet. The bus stop was nearly deserted when I got there, the air cold and damp with a faint smell of gasoline and wet asphalt. It was close to 9:30 in the evening, and the streetlights flickered unevenly above the cracked concrete slab where I waited. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, the chill crawling through the fabric and settling in my bones. The night had settled deep into the city, now quiet, but with that undercurrent of restless tension you only notice when you're alone. I checked my phone again. No signal. It was the third time in 10 minutes. Not unusual in this part of town, but the absence felt like a small weight pressing against my chest. The bus was supposed to come at 9:35, according to the schedule posted on the stop's rusty metal frame, but there was no sign of it yet. Beyond the street, the shop's shutters were pulled down, their glossy advertisements faded under grime. The occasional car passed by, its headlights slicing through the darkness, but no one else was waiting here with me. I was alone. A man appeared from the shadow of the corner store about 50 feet down the street. He was middle-aged, wearing a long, dark coat that looked too heavy for the season, and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked slowly, hands buried in his pockets, his footsteps muffled against the wet pavement. He didn't glance my way, but the way he moved didn't feel quite casual, more deliberate, measured, like he was pacing himself. I felt a flicker of unease. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired and jumpy. I'd been working late all week, barely sleeping, and my mind was probably playing tricks. But the man kept moving closer, and when he reached the bus shelter, he stopped beside me. He didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his cap. I shifted, crossing my arms, trying to make myself smaller. The street was too quiet for this kind of silence. It felt dense, like the air was thickening around us. My breath steamed in front of me. I thought about pulling out my phone again, but the screen was still dead. No bars, no messages. Just that dull black void. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally rounded the corner, its headlights bright and sudden. The man stepped away from the shelter and melted back into the shadows as the bus pulled up. I got on without looking back, choosing a seat near the middle where I could see the driver and the front windows. The ride was nearly empty, just a couple of other passengers scattered in the dim interior. The bus rattled through the streets, turning left, then right, the city's familiar skyline blurred behind rain-speckled windows. My nerves slowly eased as we moved, the motion comforting in a way. But then I noticed something. The man from the shelter was on the bus too. He was sitting alone in one of the back seats, his head bent forward, cap still on, shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Why was he on the same bus? The odds were thin, but not impossible. Still, something about the way he hadn't looked at me, hadn't said a word, made me want to keep an eye on him. I considered moving seats, but the bus was nearly empty, and any sudden movement might attract attention. Besides, the driver was watching the road, the only other passenger was asleep, head resting against the window. As we passed a cluster of storefronts, the man suddenly looked up, glancing toward me. The moment our eyes met, he jerked his head away, fixing his gaze out the window like nothing had happened. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to focus on the streetlights, the familiar landmarks ticking by, but my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. At the next stop, a woman got on, her arms wrapped around a small child. The man stood up abruptly, moving toward the back exit. I watched him go, unsure if he was getting off or just pacing the bus. The door hissed open and closed again, and the bus pulled away without him. Relief flooded me, but it was thin, fragile. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the man was just a coincidence, another late-night traveler with no intention beyond getting home. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of footsteps lingering just behind me when I wasn't looking. The city at night had always felt different, not quite as safe as the day, but this was a new kind of tension, one that gnawed at the edges of my awareness. I leaned my head against the cool window, trying to steady my breathing. The bus rumbled on through the night, and the city's noise faded into a low hum. I was counting the stops, reminding myself exactly where to get off. My neighborhood was next, just a few minutes more. When my stop came, I gathered my things slowly, glancing over my shoulder before stepping off. The street was nearly empty, the glow of lampposts casting long shadows on the sidewalk. There was no sign of him. Just the quiet hum of the city settling down for the night. I started walking toward my apartment, the soft click of my shoes on the pavement the only sound. The door to my building was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. My breath caught. I frowned, quickening my pace but trying not to run. Maybe someone had left it open by accident. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew and garbage. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, keys in hand, heart beating faster with each step. Outside my door, I hesitated. I didn't hear anything unusual, no creaks, no whispers, no movement, but the door looked slightly off. The deadbolt was undone. I pushed the door open slowly. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn. I flicked on the light switch. Nothing. The bulb must have burned out. I pulled out my phone, using the screen's glow to scan the room. Everything looked in place. The couch, the coffee table, my books stacked unevenly on the shelf. Nothing was out of order. I exhaled deeply, telling myself I was just tired, letting my imagination run wild. Then I heard it, a soft noise from my bedroom. A scraping, like something dragging across the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wasn't alone. I crept toward the door, trying to make no sound. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, from inside, a voice whispered, low and deliberate. "Didn't expect you home so early." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The door handle began to turn. I hadn't meant to stay out so late. The plan was simple: finish the shift at the diner, grab some coffee at the gas station across the street, then head home. It was the kind of slow Tuesday night that made time stretch impossibly long and every customer easier to keep track of. Nothing unusual, just the usual mix of truckers, night shift workers, and the occasional traveler passing through the town after dark. By the time I clocked out, the neon sign above the diner flickered intermittently, and the air outside was sharp with the first hints of autumn cold. I pulled my jacket tighter, the fabric stiff from the day's wear, and crossed to the gas station. The light inside buzzed overhead as I opened the door, the bell jingling softly behind me. The cashier gave a quick nod without looking up from his phone. I grabbed a cup of black coffee from the dispenser, the liquid hot and bitter in my hands. The place smelled like stale cigarettes and cleaning spray. I stepped back outside, clutching the cup, watching the parking lot with its few scattered cars. The street lamps created pools of yellow light on the asphalt, but the edges of the lot faded into shadow quickly. I was about to head for my car when I noticed a man standing near the pumps. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, hands shoved into his pockets. I didn't recognize him from the neighborhood, and something about the way he shifted weight from one foot to the other made me hesitate. I told myself to ignore it, maybe he was waiting for a ride or just needed a break from driving. I had no reason to be suspicious. But then he turned his head slowly, and I caught the faint outline of his eyes glinting in the dim light. He seemed to be watching me. Not just glancing, but holding my gaze like he was trying to figure something out. My chest tightened, and I took a cautious step towards my car. The gravel crunched beneath my boots louder than usual. I glanced over my shoulder, and the man was still there, his shape unmoving except for his head, which tilted slightly as if considering whether to follow. I fumbled with my keys, the metal cold and slippery in my sweaty palm. The door handle didn't cooperate at first, slipping beneath my fingers. I finally got inside and locked the doors behind me, heart pounding enough to drown out the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I sat for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The man hadn't moved from his spot by the pumps. I debated driving away, but the thought of leaving the gas station meant passing him again on the road. I wasn't sure if that would be worse. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and rough, but it grounded me. I considered calling someone, anyone, but the signal on my phone was weak, and the battery was almost dead. I told myself I was overreacting. Then the man started walking. He didn't hurry. Just a slow, steady pace towards the edge of the lot. Every step sounded crisp in the quiet night. I watched the shadow he cast stretch longer, reaching toward my car like a dark finger. I locked my doors again, this time more forcefully. The headlights caught his face for a second, more defined now. He looked younger than I expected, maybe early 20s. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his stare sent a jolt of pure fear through me. I tried to start the car, but the engine sputtered twice before it roared to life. The noise was deafening in the silence. The man stopped. He didn't run or shout, he just stood still and watched. I pulled out slowly, the tires crunching on gravel. As I turned onto the main road, I checked my mirrors. He stayed by the pumps, as if waiting for something. I took the highway home, the coffee long gone cold on the seat beside me. The streetlights flashed by in a blur, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following every curve. Nothing. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was dark, silent except for the occasional creak from settling wood. I stayed in the car for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I saw it. On the porch step, there was a small pile of dirt, freshly disturbed. I hadn't noticed it before, but the footprints around it were clear, barely covered in the faint glow of the porch light. The dirt looked like it had been moved recently, maybe by someone digging. I'm not a paranoid person. I've never been one to jump to worst-case scenarios. But with that pile of dirt, the man at the gas station, and the way he watched me like I was a puzzle to solve, every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't safe. I locked the doors behind me and went inside, checking every window, every lock. The house smelled like wood polish and the faint trace of last night's dinner. I didn't sleep, the shadows in every corner twisting into threats. By morning, the dirt on the porch was gone, washed away by a light drizzle. The man was nowhere in sight, and the world looked normal again. But I knew he was still out there, watching, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. I spent the day barricading the windows with whatever I could find, the silence pressing down heavier than the storm clouds gathering overhead. I never thought I'd be scared to walk home from the grocery store, but that night, every step felt like a gamble. It was late, around 10:30, and the sky was heavy with low clouds pressing down on the city, dulling the streetlight's usual glare. I'd taken the shortcut through the park behind my apartment complex, figuring it would be faster and quieter than sticking to the main road. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves, with no breeze to move the stillness that wrapped over everything like a thick blanket. I clutched the plastic bags tighter, the crinkle of the handles sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The park was nearly deserted, just a couple of benches and the faint outline of the playground equipment, its swings frozen in place. I told myself there was nothing to worry about. It was a weekday, people were probably home, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly known for trouble. But something about the way the shadows pulled beneath the trees made me quicken my pace despite that. Halfway through, I saw him. At first, I thought maybe it was just a guy sitting on the bench, but as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't sitting still. He was rocking slightly, like a pendulum, and the way his head tilted made me think he was listening, or watching too carefully. I passed by without looking directly at him, trying to keep my steps steady, but the sound of my shoes on the gravel seemed to echo against the empty paths, and I caught the faint rustle of dry leaves behind me. I told myself to ignore it. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But then a twig snapped, sharp and deliberate, and my heart kicked harder against my ribs. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was up now, standing near the far side of the bench. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if he was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I turned my head forward again, my throat tightening. The park exit was a short 20 meters ahead, just beyond the chain-link fence that separated the park from the main street. I decided not to stop. I just kept walking, my pace quickening. Behind me, the gravel crunched again. Footsteps. Not heavy, but steady. I tried to control my breathing, to not let panic seep in, but it was getting harder to ignore. My mind scrambled for options. I had my phone in one of the bags. Maybe if I called someone, made noise, but I didn't want to give away how scared I was. That could make things worse. I glanced back again. The man was closer now, walking with long strides, his coat flapping slightly in the still air. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but there was something about the way he moved, without hesitation, without doubt, that set my nerves on fire. The exit gate was just ahead, but it wasn't locked. I pushed the bags ahead of me, reaching for the latch. My hands trembled enough to make it hard to lift the gate. A sudden breeze ruffled dead leaves across the path, and I heard the man's voice, low, almost a whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. I froze. He was right behind me now. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, cold like ice. I didn't dare turn. Instead, I yanked the gate open and stepped through, slamming it shut hard behind me. The metal clang echoed, and I immediately fumbled for the latch to lock it, my fingers fumbling in panic until I heard the satisfying click. The street was empty, but I could hear the faint hum of traffic a few blocks away. I started walking fast, the bags swinging and bumping against my legs. I kept glancing over my shoulder but saw no sign of the man. Maybe I'd lost him in the park. Maybe he'd given up. Still, I didn't slow down until I reached the lit storefronts on Main Street. When I finally stepped into the light, the tension in my shoulders eased just a bit. The warmth from a nearby cafe spilled onto the sidewalk, and I half considered going in just to be around other people. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed my roommate's number, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey." "I think someone was following me through the park," I said quietly when she answered. "I'm at Main and 5th now. Can you come get me?" She promised she would, and I started pacing near the bus stop, eyes scanning every shadow, every figure that passed. Minutes stretched unbearably until I saw her car's headlights turn onto the street. Relief washed over me like a wave, and I hurried into the passenger seat, locking the door almost automatically. As we drove home, the streetlights flickered past like a slideshow of flashing warnings. She kept asking questions, but all I could think about was that man on the bench, the way he'd watched me, the way he'd followed. Who was he? Why had he been there? Was it random, or had he been waiting for someone else and I just stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time? Once inside the apartment, I double-checked every lock and closed all the curtains. The city's usual nighttime sounds, sirens, distant voices, cars, felt intrusive and unwelcome. I sat with my back against the door, phone in hand, half expecting to hear a scratch or a knock. But the building was quiet. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak felt like footsteps. Every shadow on the wall was a figure watching. I kept the lights on, the door locked, and my phone close. The man was still out there somewhere. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped. The night shift was supposed to be the easiest one yet. I worked a late closing shift at the small grocery store on the edge of town, something to keep my hours steady and my mind distracted. It was quiet, usually. The kind of place where you could stand behind the register and watch the snow drift lazily against the windows, the cold making everything feel muffled and still. At least, that's how it had been before tonight. I clocked in at 8 p.m., the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. The store smelled like stale bread, melted plastic, and that faint chemical tang from the cleaning supplies the morning crew used. I'd barely had a chance to settle into the rhythm of scanning items when the first odd thing happened. A man walked in. He was maybe in his late 30s, tall, with a windbreaker zipped up all the way to his chin despite the fact the heating was on full blast inside. His hair was damp, like he'd just come in from the rain, which wasn't forecasted. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, and his eyes didn't meet mine once. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the shelves, like he was reading every label, over and over. His slow, measured steps echoed in the quiet store. I told myself not to worry. People get strange, especially late at night. Maybe he just liked the cold. But there was something about the way he moved, like he was calculating, that made my skin crawl. As he wandered the aisles, I noticed one thing that didn't quite add up. He kept glancing at the exit door, then over at me, as if timing something. When he finally selected a bottle of water and shuffled toward the register, I forced a polite smile. "Just the water tonight?" I asked. He nodded, barely audible. His voice was dry, clipped. "Yeah." The transaction was slow. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, counted exact change in a shaky hand. When I handed him the bag, he hesitated, his fingers brushing mine for a second too long. The light from the overhead bulb caught something in his eyes, an odd flicker I couldn't place. He left without a word. I took a breath and tried to shake off the tension that had coiled in my gut. The night was supposed to be uneventful. I had less than 4 hours left. An hour passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. I was restocking cereal boxes when the bell above the door chimed again. I looked up immediately. The man was back. This time he didn't wonder. He walked straight up to the counter, eyes locked on mine. His windbreaker was unzipped, revealing a plain black t-shirt beneath. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, but his shoulders were tense, like he was bracing for something. "Do you have a phone I could use?" His voice was low, almost pleading. I hesitated. The store phone was on the wall behind me, but the policy was clear, no customer use. Plus, something about the urgency in his voice didn't sit right. "No, sorry," I said, trying to keep my tone firm but not hostile. He swallowed hard, nodded, then turned toward the aisles again. I watched him carefully. He moved with a kind of frustrated energy now, pacing slowly but purposefully near the exit. The bell rang a third time. A different man entered, this one roughly my age, with a dark beanie pulled low over his forehead and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. He scanned the store quickly, eyes flicking from the shelves to me, then settled on the first man near the door. That's when the tension shifted. The first man looked back, and for a moment their eyes met, sharp and unmistakably familiar. Not friends, but something else, something like shared history, or an unspoken agreement. The second man came closer, slow and deliberate. I stepped back behind the register as a chill ran down my spine. "Hey," the second man said, voice gravelly. "You got a light?" I glanced between them, hands clenched so tightly I thought my knuckles would crack. Neither looked at me now, only at each other. The first man pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, but didn't move to light one. Instead, he shook his head and muttered something I couldn't catch. Suddenly the second man's posture stiffened. He looked around the empty store, then back at me. "You closing soon?" he asked, more sharply this time. I nodded, voice caught somewhere in my throat. The two men exchanged a few words in hushed tones, their backs turned to me. Something about the way they spoke made me feel like a dangerous secret was being passed between them. My heart pounded as I tried to focus on the register screen, pretending to scan non-existent items. Every instinct screamed at me to call the police or lock the door, but the store was open, and I was alone. Then the first man walked over to the freezer aisle, kneeling down to pull out a pack of frozen peas. The second man followed, their voices low but urgent. I caught a phrase, "Can't risk it." Not tonight. Not tonight. The words echoed in my mind. The bell rang again. I froze. But it wasn't a customer. It was the store manager, Mr. Carlson, early to pick up some paperwork he forgot. Relief flooded through me, but it was brief. As Mr. Carlson approached, the two men stood up quickly. The first man tucked the frozen peas under his jacket and gave me a hard look that lasted a beat too long. "Hey, Mike," Mr. Carlson greeted, cheerful and unsuspecting. The two men nodded curtly, then, just as suddenly as they arrived, walked out the door without a word. Mr. Carlson glanced at me, puzzled by my pallor. "Did you need help with something?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Just a slow night." He stayed for a few minutes, chatting about routine stuff, until the clock ticked past 11. I told him I was ready to lock up, and he nodded, heading for the back office to finish his paperwork. After the door clanged shut behind him, the store felt emptier than ever. I double-checked the locks and peered through the windows. No sign of the two men. Just the quiet street, slick with melting snow, streetlights casting halos through the mist. I kept the store phone near, fingers twitching with the urge to call someone, anyone. Minutes stretched into an hour. No footsteps. No distant voices. Just the eerie hum of the freezer and the dull buzz of the lights overhead. But I knew better than to trust the quiet. Because tonight, I realized, was only the beginning. Story 5, Silent Sands of the Forgotten Resort. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could unravel into something so unsettling. It began with the usual mix of excitement and nervous anticipation you feel when stepping into unfamiliar territory. I had booked a cabin in the mountains, a small retreat 3 hours from the city where I could unwind, read, and escape the noise of everyday life. The pictures online showed a rustic but cozy place, surrounded by dense woods and nothing but the sounds of nature. It sounded perfect. The drive up was uneventful at first. The roads wound higher into the hills, trees thickening on either side until the sunlight barely touched the ground. I kept the windows down, letting the damp, pine-scented air fill the car. Somewhere along the way, though, a fog started rolling in, thick and white, like a curtain lowering over the landscape. I slowed down, squinting through the mist, the edges of the road blurring into an indistinct gray. My phone signal had already dropped to 1 bar when I'd left the town proper, and now it disappeared completely. I wasn't worried yet. The GPS kept tracking, even if sluggishly, and the silence of the forest was oddly calming. I reached the last stretch of unpaved road and finally spotted the cabin sign half hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked smaller in person than in the photos, weathered wood, chipped paint, and the kind of porch that sagged slightly in the middle. Still, it was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the place smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty books and a few knickknacks that seemed untouched for years. I unpacked some clothes, set up my laptop on the small dining table, and poured a cup of coffee. The first night passed quietly, save for the occasional creak of the owls settling and the distant call of an owl. The next morning, I woke to a strange silence. Usually, the forest thrived with birdsong at dawn, but now it was eerily still, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I checked outside. The fog had thickened overnight, hugging the trees and blanketing the ground in a soft, white haze. It was beautiful in a way, but also oppressive. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The cabin sat near a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, and I figured a short hike would be harmless. I grabbed a flashlight, a water bottle, and my phone, hoping to capture some photos. As I stepped onto the path, the mist seemed to shift around me, muffling my footsteps. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close, their branches tangled overhead. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes I couldn't quite place. About 20 minutes in, I came to a small clearing. The fog was thinner here, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden bench, its paint peeling and legs half sunken into moss. I sat for a moment, trying to shake off a growing sense of unease. That's when I noticed the markings on the bench. Carved deep into the wood were letters and symbols, some kind of graffiti, but older than anything recent. The shapes were jagged and uneven, almost like a crude language. I reached out to touch them, brushing my fingers over the rough surface. The wood was damp and cold, almost as if it had been soaked by the fog itself. Suddenly, a distant sound snapped me back, something like footsteps, but soft and irregular, not matching my own pace. I stood quickly, scanning the treeline, but all I could see was the swirling mist. I told myself it was probably another hiker or a deer moving through the undergrowth. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with alertness. I hurried back along the trail, eager to reach the cabin. When I finally stepped inside, I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. The rest of the day passed with strange interruptions. My phone remained dead, the laptop refused to connect to Wi-Fi, and the silence outside grew heavier. I tried to read, but the words blurred, and my eyes kept darting to the window. Just before dusk, I heard it again, the soft, uneven footsteps circling the cabin's perimeter. I peeked outside. Nothing moved except the swaying branches. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak, every whisper of wind, felt amplified in the darkness. I kept imagining shadows lurking just beyond the curtain of fog. At some point, I thought I heard it tapping at the window, light but deliberate. When I turned on the porch light, nothing was there. By morning, the fog had lifted, revealing the forest bathed in sunlight and seeming almost benign once more. I debated leaving early but hesitated. Something about the place tugged at me, a mixture of dread and fascination I couldn't explain. I decided to pack up and drive back, promising myself no more detours. As I loaded the car, I caught one last glimpse of the bench and the clearing through the rearview mirror. The carved symbols looked different now, more distinct, sharper. And for a moment, I was sure I saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. But when I blinked, there was nothing. I left the mountains behind, the cabin disappearing into the folds of mist and memory. But even now, back in the city's endless noise, I can't shake the feeling that something from those woods followed me home. Something waiting in the quiet corners of my mind, waiting to be seen again. The morning light seeped weakly through the threadbare curtains of the cabin, casting long, wavering shadows across the uneven wooden floor. I woke with a start, the silence around me unsettling, too complete, too heavy for any place I was used to. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and something else, something metallic and cold that I couldn't place. My head throbbed from the restless sleep, and as I sat up, the thin walls seemed to breathe with a low, almost imperceptible creak. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes and tugging at the ragged edges of the faded holiday decorations I'd found hanging in the hallway. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the residue of a nightmare I couldn't remember but could feel pressing on my chest. The cabin wasn't what I expected, not even close. I had planned a quiet weekend getaway in the mountains, just me and a few books, maybe a bit of hiking. Instead, I was stranded somewhere I'd never heard of, with no cell service and a creeping sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. I dressed quickly in the falling light, the chill biting through my thin sweater as I stepped outside. The sky was a dull gray, the trees standing like silent sentinels against a backdrop of rolling mist. A few birds called out in the distance, their cries sharp and sudden. I forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to shake the heaviness that had settled in my chest overnight. The small dirt road leading away from the cabin was twisted and overgrown, the way forward obscured by brambles and fallen branches. I started walking, hoping to find a sign of a nearby town or even just a place where I could get a phone signal. The forest closed in around me, the canopy thick and tangled, swallowing the weak daylight. Every crunch of leaves underfoot sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself flinching at the slightest snap of a twig. After an hour of wandering, I came across an old, rusted mailbox leaning precariously on a single post. The faded lettering was barely legible, Harrington. I didn't remember seeing that name on any maps, but it was something. Maybe a house or a small settlement nearby. Hope flickered briefly, and I pushed deeper into the woods. The trees thinned, and I emerged onto a narrow clearing. In the distance, a cluster of buildings huddled under the overcast sky, peeling paint, sagging roofs, and windows that stared blankly like empty eye sockets. There was no movement, no sign of life, just the oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. A broken swing set creaked in a weak breeze, its chains rattling softly. I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the vast silence. No answer. Just the echo of my own breath and the rustle of leaves. I felt suddenly exposed, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I turned back toward the cabin, deciding it was safer to wait out the day there. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the path I'd taken felt unfamiliar, as if the woods themselves had rearranged in the hours I'd been away. Panic twisted in my gut, urging me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm, marking trees with scratches on the bark to track my progress. Back at the cabin, I bolted the door and slid the rusty bolt into place. The interior felt colder somehow, the walls closing in. I checked my phone again, still no signal. The battery had dropped overnight despite minimal use. I was alone, isolated, and increasingly unmoored. I spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, finding a dusty journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. The handwriting was hurried and jagged, entries dated back nearly 30 years. The author wrote of strange occurrences in the woods, disappearances, eerie lights, and a creeping dread that settled like a fog over the area. The last entry was smudged and incomplete, ending abruptly with the words, "They come with a mist." A sudden knock on the door made me jump. Heart hammering, I crept to the window and peered out. No one was there. The wind howled through the trees, and the broken swing set groaned again. I locked the door tighter, pressing my back against it, trying to steady my breath. Night fell quickly, and the darkness outside the cabin was absolute. I lit the meager fire in the stove and settled near it, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Every shadow seemed to twitch and pulse, every sound outside a whisper of something watching, waiting. Hours passed. Then, a faint rustling at the edge of the clearing. I glanced up, eyes straining to pierce the gloom. Shapes moved just beyond the tree line, impossible to make out, but undeniably there. I told myself it was animals, the wind, anything but what I feared. Sleep was impossible. I sat frozen, listening as the noises drew closer, the mist curling in tendrils around the cabin like fingers trying to pry the door open. The journal's final warning echoed in my mind, "They come with a mist." And that's when I saw it, a pale figure stepping from the shadows, face obscured, eyes reflecting a cold, unblinking light. I don't remember how long I stared, unable to move or scream, trapped in a moment that felt like the edge of a nightmare made real. The knocking returned, soft this time, deliberate. Not on the door, but on the window beside me. I swallowed hard, backing away slowly, heart pounding in my ears. The figure's lips parted, and a voice like dry leaves whispered through the glass. "Welcome back." The dawn was thin and gray when I woke, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even when you're under 3 layers of blankets. I lay still for a long time, listening. The house was silent except for the subtle creaks and groans of old wood settling, nothing unusual, but my nerves had been frayed enough to make every sound feel like a warning. I tried to tell myself it was just the house, but the shadow of last night's terror clung stubbornly to my skin. I sat up slowly, trying to gather my thoughts. The window was cracked open just an inch, and the sharp scent of pine and wet earth drifted in. Outside, the mountains loomed, their ragged peaks dusted with snow. The cold air tasted like freedom, but I knew that freedom was a lie. Something was wrong here, and the more I tried to ignore it, the heavier the feeling became. I had to move. Staying in that room, trapped with the memories of what I'd seen or thought I'd seen, was a slow death of anxiety. I got up carefully, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. As I crossed to the door, a faint sound caught my ear, a soft thudding, rhythmic and distant. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just the house again, or maybe a branch hitting the side of the cabin. Downstairs was dark and cold. The only light came from the dull morning sky filtering through the curtains. I flicked on the kitchen light, and the bulb buzzed weakly before settling into a pale glow. The room smelled stale, with a hint of something burnt. I frowned and glanced at the coffee maker left on the counter. No coffee, just a scorched pot. The house was supposed to be empty when I got here, a last-minute rental I'd booked online after my flight was cancelled. The description was clear: secluded cabin, perfect for a quiet retreat. No mention of anything odd or off-putting, and yet I was beginning to doubt every word. I pulled on a sweater and stepped outside, hoping fresh air would clear my head. The yard was small, overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves, pressed down by frost. Beyond the yard, the forest stretched thick and dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels. I walked toward the edge of the property, eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, footprints in the mud, not mine. They were fresh, the earth still soft where someone had pressed their shoe. The prints led from the woods right up to the cabin and then disappeared near the back door. My breath caught. I hadn't heard or seen anyone last night. No cars, no other lights. The nearest neighbor was miles away. How had someone come so close without me knowing? I stepped back inside, my pulse quickening. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. I locked every door and window, even though I was sure it did little good. Then I searched the house for anything out of place. Drawers left open, objects moved, strange marks on the walls. Nothing. Except the faint smell of burnt wood again, stronger now near the fireplace. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the hearth. There were ashes still warm to the touch. Someone had lit a fire here recently after I arrived. That meant I wasn't alone. But who? And why had they left the footprints outside? A sudden noise made me jump, a soft scrape from the kitchen. I spun around, heart racing, and saw the back door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it. The cold wind pushed the door wider, rattling the frame. Panic rose, sharp and raw. I grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy cast iron skillet, and crept toward the door. Outside, the yard was empty. No sign of anyone. But the door stood open, swinging gently on its hinges. I closed it firmly and double-checked the lock. Then I told myself to calm down, that maybe the wind had pushed it open, or the previous renter had left it like that. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Someone had been here, and they might still be. The day dragged on like a nightmare. Every creak and whisper from the forest set my nerves on edge. I avoided the windows and stayed close to the center of the house. I tried calling for help, but the phone was dead, no signal, no line. The isolation was suffocating. That evening, while trying to prepare a simple meal, I heard footsteps outside again. This time, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, the skillet ready in my hand. The sound stopped near the front door, then moved away into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the black forest, waiting for dawn. The footprints outside had multiplied, tracing a wide circle around the cabin. Whoever it was stalking me, playing some cruel game. Morning came cold and gray again, but I felt more desperate than ever. I packed a small bag, planning to leave, but when I tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. I thought I'd locked it from the inside, but now it was stuck fast. I shoved and yanked, but the door held firm. Fear twisted inside me. I wasn't just trapped by this house or by the loneliness. Something else had me locked in, a presence unseen, but palpably close. I turned back to the windows and found the curtains pushed aside, wide open. The footprints led up to the glass, then vanished. Someone had been watching me all along. I sank to the floor, the skillet dropped from my hand. The forest outside seemed to press closer, the shadows deeper. I realized then that I was no longer just a visitor in this place. I was prey. And whatever was out there wasn't finished yet. The morning air in the small town was deceptively bright, sunlight filtering through a thin layer of mist that clung to the streets like a shroud. I woke with a groggy sense of unease that hadn't left me since the night before. The shadows in my rented room seemed elongated and restless, as if they were waiting for something just beyond the edges of my vision. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was simply exhausted from the journey and the unsettling events that had unfolded since my arrival. I dressed quickly, pulling on the same clothes from yesterday because the hotel's laundry service was non-existent and the weather was chilly enough to justify it. Outside, the town was quiet, almost eerily so. There were a few locals moving about, but their faces were blank and their movements deliberate, lacking the usual energy you'd expect from a morning crowd. I had noticed this since I arrived. The people here didn't seem to want to engage. Even the shopkeeper at the corner store had greeted me with a nod and no further words. I needed information, something to explain the strange occurrences and the pervasive sense of dread I felt growing with each hour. My only lead was a faded brochure I found tucked behind the counter at the hostel, a recommendation for a nearby village called 𝐼𝐻𝐻, supposedly a charming place for travelers looking for an authentic experience. It was about 10 miles from here, nestled in the hills. The brochure boasted quaint cottages, local festivals, and a history dating back centuries. Nothing hinted at anything sinister. I rented a bicycle from a small shop near the square, the owner barely glancing my way as he handed me the keys. The bike was old, the paint chipped, chain creaking, but it was the best option I had. I set off toward 𝐼𝐻𝐻, the road winding through dense woods and rising gently as I pedaled. The mist thickened as I rode, clinging to the trees and the underbrush, muffling the sound of my tires on the asphalt. About halfway there, I pulled over to catch my breath and checked my phone. No signal. It was the same all over this region, no reliable connection. A wave of isolation washed over me. No way to call for help if I needed it. I considered turning back, but something urged me onward. Maybe answers awaited me at 𝐼𝐻𝐻. The village emerged from the fog like a mirage, old stone cottages lining narrow, cobblestone streets. It wasn't quite as picturesque as the brochure made it seem. The buildings were weathered, paint peeling, windows dark and empty. Not a soul in sight. My unease deepened. I left my bike against a post and began walking. The silence was oppressive. No birds sang, no dogs barked, no children played. Just the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I wandered, I noticed odd details, doors slightly ajar, curtains twitching despite the absence of breeze, a faint, acrid smell in the air like burnt wood mixed with something metallic. I found the town square, a small plaza with a cracked fountain at its center. The water was stagnant and dark. Around the square were several shops, all closed, their signs faded beyond recognition. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a low, dragging sound. I spun around, but saw nothing. Just shadows stretching toward me from the alleys. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, at the edge of the square, a figure appeared. An old man, hunched and wrapped in a tattered coat. His eyes caught the sunlight, reflecting a sharp, unnatural gleam. He didn't speak, only pointed a gnarled finger toward a narrow path leading away from the village center. Curiosity and fear warred within me, but I followed the path, weaving between skeletal trees that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The trail led uphill to a clearing. At its center stood a stone monument, half swallowed by moss and vines, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Beneath it lay a small bundle wrapped in dirty cloth. I hesitated, heart pounding, but the need to know outweighed caution. I knelt and gently unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a diary, its leather cover cracked and stained. The handwriting was cramped, hurried. I flipped through the pages, and the entries grew darker as I read. The writer was a villager who had lived here decades ago, chronicling strange happenings, disappearances, unseasonal storms, animals found mutilated. The last entry ended abruptly. They come in the fog. We try to hide, but the village is cursed. Paolo calls. A sudden chill raced down my spine. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned to see the old man standing there, closer than before, his face now gaunt and pale, eyes hollow. "Leave," he whispered, voice like dry leaves. "Before it's too late." Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the diary. The old man's form seemed to flicker, as if caught between this world and another. I ran back down the path, the fog thickening, branches scraping my arms like claws. When I reached my bike, I found it overturned, the chain off the gears. I cursed under my breath and struggled to fix it, glancing over my shoulder. Shadows moved just beyond the tree line, watching. Finally, the chain slipped back into place. I mounted the bike and pedaled furiously down the hill, the fog swirling thicker and colder. The road back to town seemed endless, the landscape warping around me. When I arrived, the streets were empty again. I headed straight for the hostel, heart hammering, the diary pressed against my chest like a talisman. Inside, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, trying to steady my breath. Outside my window, the fog crept closer, tendrils reaching toward the building like hungry hands. The town held its breath, waiting. I didn't know what I had stumbled into, but one thing was clear: this holiday was no vacation. It was a trap. And whatever haunted these hills was far from done with me. The morning air in the village was sharp and cold, but this time it didn't feel like a breath of fresh relief. Instead, it clung to my skin like a warning. I sat on the edge of the creaky bed in the small guest room, staring at the cracked window that overlooked the street below. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with thick clouds that threatened rain. I kept replaying everything that had happened since I arrived, trying to piece together the fragments of a nightmare I had yet to fully understand. Last night's attempt to reach out for help had failed miserably. The phone in the room was dead, no signal, no dial tone, nothing. Even my cell phone stubbornly refused to connect to any network. I had spent hours wandering the village, hoping to find someone willing to talk, or at least a place with a working landline. But the houses were shuttered, and the streets were empty except for the occasional figure disappearing behind curtains or locked doors. I hadn't seen anyone my age, no tourists, no travelers. Just the odd elderly person moving slowly with a cane or a dog. Their eyes, when they glanced at me, were cold and unreadable, as if they carried a secret they didn't want to share. I tried to strike up a conversation with a woman tending a small vegetable stall, but she only shook her head, muttering something in a language I barely recognized, and vanished into her home before I could ask again. The atmosphere was suffocating. The village seemed frozen in time, a place that had been waiting for me, or for something like me, to arrive. The buildings, once charming and weathered by years of sun and wind, now felt like silent witnesses to something long buried and best left undisturbed. After the fruitless morning, I decided to explore the outskirts. Maybe the forest paths leading away from the village would offer an escape, or at least a clearer picture of where I was trapped. I packed a small bag with what little food and water I had left, pulled on my coat, and stepped outside. The chill bit into my face, and the sky darkened further as a low wind stirred the dead leaves along the narrow roads. The path I took was overgrown with brambles and wildflowers, winding away from the last houses like a thread unraveling from a faded tapestry. My footsteps echoed quietly in the stillness, but there was something about the silence that gnawed at me, an unnatural pause, like the world was holding its breath. I walked for nearly an hour, the landscape stretching out into rolling hills blanketed with thick fog. The deeper I ventured, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The mist curled around my ankles and rose to obscure the path ahead. I considered turning back, but there was a nagging curiosity I couldn't shake. Why had I been brought here? What was I supposed to find? Then I heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of leaves, but beneath that, there was a low humming. It was a voice, or something like it, distant and melodic but chilling in its cadence. I stopped and strained to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest, pulling me forward with its strange allure. My heart hammered as I followed the sound, each step hesitant but driven by a need I couldn't explain. The fog thickened until I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The humming became clearer, weaving through the trees like an invisible thread. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It was warped, layered with echoes that made it sound almost otherworldly. Then I saw it, a small clearing bathed in a sickly pale light that filtered weakly through the fog. In the center stood an old stone well, its edges cracked and worn by time. The humming seemed to be coming from deep within it, a low vibration that resonated in my chest. I stepped closer, peering over the edge into the darkness below. At first, I saw nothing but blackness, but then the light shifted. Something moved, a pale shape, twisting and coiling just out of reach. I blinked, suddenly overwhelmed by a surge of vertigo and nausea. My head spun, and I grabbed the rim of the well to steady myself. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The forest was still once more, the silence pressing down like a weight. I didn't know how long I stood there, caught between fear and fascination. The well seemed to be a focal point, a place where the village's secrets bubbled to the surface. I could feel something watching me, something ancient and patient. I turned away and retraced my steps back to the village, the humming fading until it was nothing more than a memory. When I reached the first houses, the sky had begun to weep cold rain, and I was soaked through by the time I slipped back into my room. I closed the window tightly against the storm and sank onto the bed, exhausted but haunted. I pulled out my journal and tried to write everything down, to make sense of the day's events. But the words felt inadequate, unable to capture the weight of what I was experiencing. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. There was something here I needed to uncover, even if it meant walking deeper into the darkness. As night fell again, I sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass. The village was silent, but the air felt charged, as if something was stirring beneath its surface. I promised myself I would be ready. Tomorrow, I would go back to the well. And I would find out what was calling me from the shadows. Story 6, Bloodline Beneath the Floorboards. The night shift always left me with a lingering sense of exhaustion that didn't quite vanish by morning. I was used to the odd hours, getting home after 2 a.m., when the streets felt bare and hollow. I told myself that being alert on the way back was part of the job. The hospital where I worked was downtown, and even though the neighborhood wasn't the worst, it had its share of late-night drunks and stray cats. I never minded the walk from the parking garage to my apartment. It was a 10-minute trek through a few quiet streets, and usually I was so tired I just kept my head down and walked fast. That night, I left work at 2:15 a.m. The air was colder than usual for late October, sharp and damp, with a faint smell of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic, like rust. My hands were shoved deep into the pockets of my coat, and I had my earphones in, soft jazz playing. I kept my phone in the other hand, the screen dim but ready in case I needed it. The streets were nearly deserted, with only the occasional distant car humming past. I tried not to think about the news stories I'd read recently, break-ins, assaults right around this part of the city. I told myself those things happen to other people, in worse areas. I took my usual route, out of the hospital's parking garage, right onto 9th, then a left onto Maple. The street lamps flickered a little, casting uneven pools of yellow light onto cracked sidewalks. I noticed a man standing near the corner of 9th and Maple, leaning against a lamppost. He wore a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face, and jeans that looked too worn for someone who cared about their appearance. I thought it was strange he was just standing there, not moving, not looking at anything in particular. But I glanced away quickly, crossing to the other side of the street as I passed. I had only gone a few steps when I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow at first, but steady, matching my pace almost exactly. It wasn't the usual shuffle of a passerby, it was deliberate, measured. I stopped, heart suddenly sharper, and waited. The footsteps stopped too, a few yards back. I waited some more, but when I resumed walking, they started again, matching me beat for beat. I turned my head, careful not to make it obvious, but I couldn't see anyone. The street behind was empty, just shadows and the occasional flicker of light from a distant window. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was the man I'd passed, waiting for a bus, or some other random person. I picked up my pace, figuring I could get home faster that way. The footsteps behind me quickened as well, closer now, but still out of sight. My breath came in short bursts, the jazz music felt useless, like a thin shield against the growing tension. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the screen, ready to call someone. I debated turning around, but fear made my limbs heavy. Maybe if I kept walking, nothing would happen. I reached Maple Street, the edge of my neighborhood. The houses here were old, some boarded up, others with flickering porch lights. I noticed a car parked on the curb about 50 feet ahead, an older model sedan with tinted windows. Inside, I could just make out the silhouette of a man slouched behind the wheel. He hadn't moved since I passed by. My skin prickled, but I tried to keep calm. Halfway down the street, I heard a low rumble behind me, what could only have been the same car starting up. The engine growled as it rolled slowly forward. I broke into a run, heart pounding so loud I thought the driver could hear it through the windows. I could see my building's entrance now, the faint glow of the lobby light welcoming me like a beacon. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking badly, and finally unlocked the door. I slammed it shut behind me and leaned against it, pressed so hard I thought the wood might crack. From inside, I peered through the peephole. The car had stopped at the corner. The driver sat motionless for what felt like forever, then slowly turned his head in my direction, though I couldn't see his face clearly. The car stayed there, engine idling, just out of sight around the corner. I didn't move until I was sure the car had driven off. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, double-checking that all the locks were secure. I texted my roommate, who was out of town, just to say I'd made it home safe. My phone stayed in my hand the whole time. I kept imagining what might have happened if I'd walked just a little slower, or if I'd looked back too soon. The shadows outside my window seemed too dark, the silence too loud. By the time dawn crept over the rooftops, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the man in the hoodie, the car that lurked in the dark, and the footsteps that followed me home. I told myself it was probably nothing. Just one of those nights. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Tomorrow, I would have to walk the same way again. Morning light felt less like safety and more like a thin veil. I forced myself up, pulling on my coat with trembling hands. The street outside was deceptively quiet, but I could still feel those eyes, watching, waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. The late afternoon sun was fading, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I was sitting in my car, parked near the back entrance of the grocery store where I worked the night shift. I usually arrived early, giving myself time to settle in, but today I had lingered in the break room, wanted to avoid going out until the last possible minute. The store was a block from a row of dilapidated apartment buildings, a place that always made me feel on edge even in daylight hours. But now, as the sky deepened from gold to bruised purple, the unease began settling like a weight in my chest. I tried to focus on the music playing softly through my phone's tiny speakers, some old jazz record, nothing too cheerful, but the sound barely cut through the hum of distant traffic and the occasional shout from the street. Across the lot, a woman with a stroller was moving slowly, her strides uneven, like she was nursing some invisible injury. Something about the way she wrinkled her nose, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, set my teeth on edge. I started the engine, wanting to leave the spot before it got too dark, when I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, half shrouded by a clump of scraggly bushes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way his shadow stretched long and thin, but then he shifted, stepping forward just enough to catch the gleam of streetlight on his pale face. He looked at me, and in that moment, my throat tightened. I locked my doors without moving. The man's eyes were too steady, too intent, and his mouth quirked into something like a smirk. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, but it felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something or someone. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for my phone to call the store, but then he turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and debated whether I should just drive away, but the thought of going inside the store alone in the dark made my skin crawl. I told myself he was probably just some local kid hanging around, maybe drunk, or worse, a junkie looking for a quick score. The neighborhood was notorious for petty crime, but nothing that had ever escalated this close to me. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow over the aisles. I made my way to the stockroom to grab the evening shipment, trying to keep my senses alert but not overwhelmed. The back door was supposed to be locked at all times, but as I approached, I saw the bolt was undone, just a crack, enough for a sliver of cold air to seep in. I thought maybe one of the other employees had left it open by accident, but a cold knot of dread twisted in my stomach. I pulled the door closed firmly and pushed the bolt back into place. The store had a security camera pointed toward the parking lot, but the feed was notoriously spotty, often glitching or cutting out completely. The manager had mentioned it a few times but never seemed concerned enough to fix it. A crackling sound came over the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt. "You okay back there?" It was Dave, the overnight cashier. His voice was casual, but I detected something, maybe a hint of impatience or a barely masked worry. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Just grabbing the shipment." "All right. Just keep your eyes open." I saw a couple of guys hanging around the front. Looked like they might be casing the place. That made my skin prickle again. "Are you sure?" "Yeah." One of them was pacing, glancing up at the cameras. I told them we're locked up tight, but they didn't leave. I nodded to myself, though no one could see me. Okay, I'll hurry. I moved faster, but the noises in the store suddenly felt amplified, the clink of a can falling from a shelf, the distant beep of the soda coolers cycling on and off. I paused, heart pounding, convinced I heard footsteps just beyond the storage room door, soft and cautious. I pressed my ear against the cool metal, trying to listen, but all I could hear was my shallow breathing. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, but the screen stayed dark, no signal. The store was in a dead zone on that side of the building. Panic tried to rise, but I pushed it down, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then the overhead lights flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and the only light came from the emergency exit sign, casting a dim red glow over the floor. My hand went to the walkie-talkie, but static hissed through the speaker. I was alone. I fumbled for the flashlight app on my phone, but the battery was nearly dead. In that weak beam, I saw the shadow moving just past the storage door, slow, deliberate, like a cat stalking prey. I swallowed hard and edged backward toward the door, hand on the handle, ready to bolt out into the parking lot. Suddenly, the door creaked open a fraction, and a voice, low and rough, whispered, "I don't want to hurt you." The words were meant to be soothing, but they sounded anything but. My mind raced. I needed to get out, to find Dave, to call the police. But my legs felt like lead. And then the door pushed open wider, revealing a man's face, half hidden in the shadows. His eyes were hard, cold, and unblinking. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as I heard the heavy footsteps retreating. The lights flickered back on seconds later, leaving me shaking against the door, trapped but temporarily safe. I didn't know his name or what he wanted, only that he had been inside, inches from me. Whatever this was, it was just beginning. I left the office later than usual that night, the sky already a bruised shade of indigo, heavy with the promise of rain. The streets were slick, reflecting street lamps in jagged orange lines that made the pavement look like a fractured mirror. I pulled my coat tighter around me and slipped my hands into my pockets, my footsteps muffled by what leaves scattered along the sidewalk. The subway station was nearly empty, which was the first thing that felt off. Usually, there were at least a few late commuters, people heading home, students, the occasional night owler like me. But the platform was a hollow echo chamber, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The smell of damp concrete mixed with the faint, sour tang of something burnt lingered in the air. I glanced around, catching a shadow near the far end of the platform. At first, I thought it was a maintenance worker, but the figure was motionless, head bowed, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a threadbare jacket. When I moved closer, the figure didn't shift. I hesitated, feeling a flicker of unease. The man, or whoever he was too still, almost statuesque. I debated whether to call out, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I decided to board the next train and not look back. The moment I stepped onto the first car, the doors hissed shut behind me, and the lights inside were dim and inconsistent, flickering in an almost lazy rhythm. I found a seat near the door and sank into it, heart beating just a little too fast. The train lurched forward with a jolt, moving sluggishly through the dark tunnels. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through news headlines, but the weak signal barely loaded anything. That's when I noticed the man from the platform had boarded the same car. He sat diagonally across from me, hunched over, his head angled downward so I couldn't see his face properly. The overhead light flickered again and suddenly illuminated his features for a split second. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to flick up toward me, lingering just a moment longer than should be comfortable. I swallowed hard and looked away, pretending to study the cracked leather seat in front of me. The silence between us was thick, oppressive, only interrupted by the irregular clack of the train wheels against the rails. It wasn't the first time I'd felt watched on public transport, but there was something different about this, less random, more deliberate. The train stopped at the next station, and a handful of people boarded. A woman with a tired expression and a toddler, a man in a suit who glanced briefly at the man opposite me before looking away, and a teenager with headphones who didn't notice anything unusual. The man didn't move. He just shifted slightly, the empty look in his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. As the train rolled on, the lights flickered again and then cut out entirely for a few seconds. The car was plunged into darkness, and a low murmur of startled voices broke out. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. When the lights flickered back on, I saw the man had moved closer, his face a few feet away now, illuminated by the pale glow of my phone. "Are you okay?" I managed to ask, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at me with an intensity that made me shiver. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked toward the next car. The door behind him hissed shut, and the train rumbled through the tunnel. I stayed in my seat, eyes glued to the empty doorway where he'd disappeared. My hands trembled slightly, and I suddenly realized how cold I was, despite the warmth of the crowded car. A wave of relief washed over me when the train pulled into the station closest to my apartment. I shoved past the other passengers and stepped off, not bothering to look back. Outside, the rain had started light at first, then steady, drumming against the pavement. The streetlights glowed hazily through the mist, and the familiar faces of late-night pedestrians littered the sidewalks. I pulled my collar up and hurried down the street, the sound of my boots splashing through puddles the only thing keeping me company. I told myself it was just a weird coincidence, a tired man's paranoia manifesting after a long day. But as I turned the corner toward my building, a shadow detached itself from a nearby alleyway and fell into step behind me. My breath caught, chest tightening with a cold, creeping fear. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I picked up my pace, the sound of footsteps matching mine growing louder, closer. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the night itself was pressing in. I reached for my keys, hands trembling, and fumbled to unlock the door. The footsteps stopped just as I slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst through my ribs. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a faint, deliberate tapping. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Nothing else. Only the steady rain outside, and the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the small hallway. I knew this wasn't over. I had never liked driving home late at night, but after that day, I had no choice. The office was a cage at night, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the occasional solitary janitor pushing a mop down endless halls, but the parking lot was worse. Mostly empty, far from the main road, surrounded by dense trees that swallowed any stray light. I kept telling myself I was overthinking everything. The man I thought I'd seen outside the building last week wasn't stalking me. It was just a coincidence. Still, when I finished my shift at midnight and slid into my car, the wind shoved at the edges of the parking lot, rattling dry leaves against the windshield. I locked the doors and started the engine, the hum of the motor sounding too loud inside the quiet cabin. As I pulled out, I noticed a figure across the lot near the far edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then the shape moved, slow and deliberate. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was probably just a man finishing his own shift, or maybe someone waiting for a ride. Plenty of people worked late hours at the hospital down the street. But my hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to keep driving rather than circle the lot or wait for someone. The road home was mostly empty, small cul-de-sacs and narrow lanes winding through residential neighborhoods. I took my usual route, even though I knew it was longer. The streetlights flickered occasionally, some posts casting long, broken pools of light that barely cut through the fog that had crept in from the river nearby. The fog always made everything look quieter, thicker, like the world was holding its breath. About 15 minutes into my drive, I noticed a car behind me. It was a dark sedan, something older but well kept. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the headlights stayed steady, matching my turns. I slowed down slightly to see if it would pass, but it stayed behind me, following every twist and stop sign as though glued to my tail. I pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent pumps buzzing under the night sky. The car slowed but didn't stop, waiting just beyond the lot's entrance. I sat still, hands clenched, heart pounding. After what felt like forever, it turned the corner and drove away. I exhaled hard, shaking off the chill crawling down my spine. I didn't want to believe someone was actually following me, but it was impossible to ignore the knot twisting in my stomach. I filled my tank quickly, kept my eyes on the doors, on the mirrors, waiting for any sign of movement. But no one showed up. I paid with a card, the machine's beep echoing in the empty station, and hurried back to my car. Back on the road, I kept glancing behind me. The dark sedan was gone. I tried to relax, picked up speed, and headed home as usual. When I pulled into my driveway, the street was unnervingly quiet. No passing cars, no rustling in the hedges, nothing but the wind brushing against the cracked pavement. I locked my car and hurried inside, closing the door behind me with a sharp click that sounded too loud in the silence. The house felt cold. I flicked on the lights one by one, the hum of the bulbs filling the rooms. I checked every window before shaking my head and going straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I leaned over the sink, I noticed something on the windowsill, a small, folded piece of paper. My heart leapt. I hadn't left anything there. I picked it up carefully, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers. Inside, there was a simple message in block letters: "I see you." The writing wasn't messy or rushed, it looked deliberate, controlled. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, every shadow suddenly suspicious. I wanted to throw the note away, call the police, do something, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The battery was low, blinking red. I cursed under my breath and stuffed the phone in my pocket, moving toward the front door, considering locking it again. A sudden creak from the living room made me freeze. I listened hard, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it echoed through the walls. The house was supposed to be empty, except me. I grabbed the nearest object, the heavy metal flashlight from the junk drawer, and crept toward the sound. The living room was empty. Nothing moved. Just the slow drip of water from the kitchen faucet, which I must have left running. I sighed in relief, but the feeling didn't last. I noticed the front door ajar. My stomach dropped. I was certain I'd locked it. Slowly, I approached, every nerve sharp and raw. The lock was untouched, but the door was cracked open enough to slip through. Cold air spilled inside, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the dark. The street was empty, no signs of footprints or disturbances. The door swung slightly in the breeze, closing with a soft thud as I pushed it shut and locked it again. Back inside, I double-checked each window, each lock, every bolt. I felt exposed, small, like the house was no longer a refuge but a trap. The lights overhead buzzed, the shadows sharp and shifting. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone was still dying, and I didn't want to alert whoever was out there that I knew. I sat down on the couch, flashlight at my side, trying to steady my breathing. My eyes kept flicking to the window, to the dark outline of the trees beyond the yard. The note in my hand felt heavier than it should, a tangible weight of threat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound, every creak and whisper of the house settling. The world outside was silent, but I knew the danger was real, closer than I wanted to admit. By dawn, the fog had lifted, and with the first light, the house felt less menacing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night hadn't ended, that somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting for the next moment when I was alone again. The late afternoon stretched thin as I sat in the corner booth at the diner on Elm Street, trying to make sense of the papers scattered in front of me. I had come here to get away from the cramped apartment, the one with the broken heater that turned my nights into a restless shiver, but the din of clinking dishes and murmured conversations wasn't helping me focus. Outside, a gray drizzle started, the kind that didn't soak you outright but left everything damp and cold. Through the white window next to my booth, I could see people pulling up collars and hurrying along the sidewalk. I was digging through old receipts and bank statements, trying to find an explanation for the odd transactions on my card. Someone had been charging small amounts, $5, $7, sometimes $10, at gas stations and convenience stores scattered all over town. Nothing big enough to trigger a fraud alert, but enough to make me uneasy. I'd called the bank earlier, and they advised me to keep an eye out, but I felt stuck, unable to take the next step. The police said they wouldn't open a case without more evidence, and without a suspect or a pattern. What could I do? As I sipped the lukewarm coffee, the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, dripping from the rain, wearing a faded leather jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He looked around, then made a beeline to the counter, ordering something quietly. I tried not to stare, but something about him made my skin crawl, a vague sense of wrongness I couldn't place. He wasn't rough or loud, just out of sync with this place. I noticed the way he glanced toward my booth once or twice, then away, his eyes darting like he was waiting for someone or something. I told myself to ignore him. Maybe I was being paranoid. After all, anyone could feel watched sometimes. I turned back to my papers, shuffling them methodically, but the uneasy feeling crept back in. When I glanced up again, the man was gone. The chair opposite me was empty. I felt a small prick of relief, but it was fleeting. Pulling out my phone, I checked the time. Just after 5 p.m. The streets outside were starting to empty, people scurrying home before the evening chill settled in. I debated whether to stay a little longer or leave. The rain had eased and was now just a soft mist coating the window pane. I told the waitress I'd have another coffee and settled back, determined to find some answers. That's when I felt the shadow fall over the table. I looked up, and the man from before was standing right there, low voice barely above the din. Mind if I sit? His presence was sudden, intrusive. I didn't want to be rude, but saying no felt impossible. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Sure. He sat without waiting, leaning forward so his eyes caught mine. There was an edge to him now, a quiet intensity that made my throat tighten. You look like you've got some trouble, he said. I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow. Yeah, something like that. He tapped a finger on the table, eyes flickering. Money troubles? I hesitated. The truth was complicated. Just some weird charges on my card. No idea who's behind it. He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. Ever think it could be someone you know? The suggestion sank in deeper than I expected. I kept my voice even. I don't know. Maybe. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. People close to you have their reasons. Sometimes the ones you trust the most are the ones who hurt you. His words felt like a cold slap, the kind that makes you stop breathing for a beat. I wanted to stand up, to get away, but the diner was full enough that I felt trapped in the booth. The rain picked up again outside, pattering harder against the windows, the sound oddly loud in the quiet moment. Do you want some help? He asked, voice low and smooth, almost coaxing. I could feel the weight of his gaze, pressing in on me. My instinct screamed to get up, to run, but my body didn't respond. Instead, I shook my head. "No, thanks." He shrugged, then leaned back, hands spread on the table. "All right. Just thought I'd offer." I forced a smile, my fingers fiddling with the edge of a napkin. "I appreciate it." He stood then, pulling his cap low again before heading toward the door. The bell jingled behind him, and for a moment, I watched his silhouette vanish into the rain-soaked street. I wanted to believe that was the last of it, that the strange encounter was just a weird coincidence, but the tight knot in my stomach said otherwise. I paid the bill, the coins clinking in the tray louder than usual. Outside, the mist had thickened, the streetlights casting long, blurry halos through the fog. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking toward the subway station, the damp chill sinking through my clothes. The underground was nearly empty, the usual crowd thinned by the early evening. I took a seat on the cold metal bench, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text. I pulled it out, my thumb hesitating before unlocking the screen. No name. Just a number I didn't recognize. The message was simple. "I saw you today." My heart jumped. I scanned the platform, half expecting to see the man from the diner lurking in the shadows. But there was no one. Just the dull hum of the trains and the faint squeak of rubber wheels on rails. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was probably a prank or a wrong number. But the timing was too close, the tone too direct. As I stood to catch the next train, I realized the small, random charges on my bank card had grown into something much bigger than just financial theft. Someone was watching me. And this time, they weren't pretending to be a stranger.